the offended ex-husband, the jealous, despotic boyfriend, the rejected suitor, a one-night stand partner, a teenager with a string of police involvements, or a niece with a better friend. One of these people killed a loving, caring, joyful mother of 3, sending the police on the trail of possible leads to catch the murderer and attempting to seek justice for the victim and her family. The question remains, will justice be served? Nature generously endowed Dana Laskovski with the best qualities one could find in a person. At 36, Dana was a very beautiful and lively woman, a kind and responsive friend, a talented artist, and a loving mother. Children constituted the most important part of Dana's life. Above all else in the world, she wanted to be a mother, but for some time, she and her husband Sam struggled to have children. However, when their family expanded to 3, Dana and Sam's happiness knew no bounds. Yet in 2000, the couple separated, and Dana, along with the children, moved to a new home in the charming town of Puyallup, Washington. In 2001, she turned her love for children into a profession. Someday she dreamed of opening her own daycare, but for the time being, she worked as a nanny. In addition to this, Dana actively supported her 17-year-old niece, Amanda, during times of difficulty with her parents. For Amanda and her best friend, Emily, Dana was the aunt that every teenager dreams of having. The girls often stayed overnight at Dana's, sought her advice on any matter, and in general considered her more of an older friend than an aunt. The rest of the important people in Dana's life included Mike, whom she met approximately a year after parting ways with her husband. Mike was a pleasant man residing in Canada, but made the effort to visit Dana as often as possible, especially since the drive wasn't too time-consuming. Unfortunately, not everything was smooth in their relationship. Dana's best friend, Shauna, and Mike's best friend, John, didn't speak highly of Mike. The main issue in their relationship was that Dana was a very beautiful woman who often attracted the attention of other men, something that, to put it mildly, did not sit well with Mike. And one of the men who showed interest in Dana, thereby irritating Mike, was Patrick. Patrick worked for a telecommunications company and met Dana when he connected her television after her move. The new neighbor immediately caught Patrick's eye, but she politely rejected his advances. However, he continued to send her flowers and love notes persistently. Initially, Dana probably considered these gestures harmless. When Mike saw flowers from a competitor, he became jealous and very angry. He demanded Patrick's phone number and address, promising to deal with the persistent suitor the same day. Dana did not appreciate this. Firstly, she just wanted to continue ignoring Patrick. Secondly, she didn't want her boyfriend making decisions for her. Mike and Dana argued, and they even decided to temporarily part ways. During this period in August 2001, which coincidentally preceded Dana's death, she had dinner with her friend Shauna. To their surprise, Mike's best friend John joined them. John had recently broken up with his girlfriend, and Dana and Mike were on a break in their relationship. That evening, fueled by alcohol and caught up in the moment, they became involved with each other, much to Mike's dismay. Literally the next day, Dana received a note from her admirer, Patrick, in which threatening undertones prevailed. It was probably only then that Dana realized she had a stalker. Patrick hinted that he had been watching her in her home. To her horror, upon inspecting her rooms, she indeed noticed that the protective screen had been removed from the window, as if someone had entered her home that way. Coincidentally, in August 2001, Dana's ex-husband Sam attempted to re-enter her life. Sam arrived unannounced to inform her that he had sold their house. For months after their separation, they had been trying to sell the house, so he bought a bottle of champagne to celebrate this development. Sam hinted at wanting to reconcile, expressing that he wasn't ready for a divorce, but they ended up having another argument, and Sam had to leave. On August 31st, 2001, the family for whom Dana worked as a nanny couldn't reach her. Dana never missed work, and certainly not without informing her employers. The family tried contacting Dana's neighbors, but they also couldn't get through to her. Concerned, they called the police and requested a welfare check to ensure everything was okay. When the police arrived at Dana's home, they knocked on the door. Getting no response, they circled the house and found the back door slightly ajar. Upon entering, they walked through the kitchen and discovered a woman lying face down on the couch. It was Dana, and she was dead. She lay in an unnatural position, with one arm above her head and the other beneath her, her body twisted in a strange way. Dana's neck showed signs of bruising. It was evident that she had been murdered. The officers immediately secured the crime scene and called in detectives. Examining the crime scene and finding bloodstains on the carpet, investigators concluded that Dana had struggled with someone before her death. After the murder, the assailant placed her on the couch, added a pillow, and covered her with a blanket, as if attempting to make her more comfortable. This strongly suggested that the crime was committed by someone known to Dana. On the other hand, a broken window hinted at a possible robbery gone wrong, especially considering the entire house had been ransacked in search of something. Investigators were perplexed, with half the evidence indicating a personal vendetta and the other half suggesting a robbery. After the autopsy, the forensic pathologist confirmed that Dana had been strangled. The murder was characterized by extreme brutality. Initially, she was severely struck on the head before being strangled, resulting in a broken trachea. This level of force indicated a very strong perpetrator. It seemed likely that the attack was not premeditated, as the killer had to pass through the kitchen, where knives were available, but chose not to use them, and instead opted for bare hands. When a wife is murdered, one of the first focuses of the police is on the husband. It quickly emerged that Sam had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on his wife. The police rushed to find him, but Sam had seemingly disappeared, becoming the prime suspect. As it turned out, Sam had gone on a camping trip with the children. He had no mobile reception throughout the night and was unaware of Dana's death until he returned to civilization and received a barrage of calls and messages. When detectives finally managed to speak with Sam, they noticed bruises on his knees. He explained that he was into baseball and got the bruises during a training session. Regarding his relationship with his wife, Sam mentioned they were not living together, had arguments, but were trying to compromise. When asked where he was on August 30th at the time of the murder, Sam said he was at home with the children, briefly left while they were sleeping, but only to refuel before his upcoming trip. Since Sam couldn't definitively prove where he was at the time of the crime and was not overly cooperative with the police, investigators tried to build a case suggesting he might have gone to see his wife on August 30th, perhaps to discuss child custody, had an argument, and killed Dana. However, his actions didn't fit the timeline of the crime. It seemed implausible for Sam to put the triplets to bed, drive 2 hours to his wife's house just to argue and kill her, then make his way back and nonchalantly take the children for a relaxing outing the next morning. This version of events didn't withstand scrutiny, but suspicions weren't entirely lifted from him either. Surveying friends and family of Dana, investigators shifted their focus to a more likely suspect, Patrick, who had been harassing the woman. Shortly before her death, Dana told friends that Patrick had become fixated on her. She realized he was truly stalking her because he knew about things he couldn't have learned through other means. It reached a point where Dana informed the family she worked for that if she were to die unexpectedly, Patrick would be to blame. Adding to this, witnesses had seen a white van, similar to Patrick's, near Dana's house in the days leading up to the crime, painting a less favorable picture for the investigator. The police obtained a warrant to collect Patrick's DNA and search his home and van. Patrick reacted harshly, being rude and uncooperative when they arrived. However, as officers began the search, Patrick reviewed the search warrant and only then realized they were investigating Dana's murder. He had initially thought they had come to arrest him for harassment. Once he grasped the gravity of the situation, his behavior immediately changed. Patrick agreed to provide fingerprints, a DNA sample, anything to assist the investigation. He also mentioned his whereabouts on the night of the murder. After work, he stayed late with friends. His alibi was fully corroborated. Detectives reluctantly had to acknowledge that Patrick had been incredibly lucky because many witnesses and circumstantial evidence had pointed to him. Deprived of a potential suspect, investigators turned their attention to Mike, Dana's boyfriend. However, before they could talk to the Canadian, they discovered interesting information about him. Dana's best friend, Shauna, reluctantly admitted that Dana was unhappy with Mike's constant control lately. Additionally, Dana had cheated on Mike with his best friend, John. Curiously, John was genuinely in love with Dana, desired a serious relationship, and believed Mike wasn't a suitable match for her. In Dana's infidelity with John, investigators saw a clear motive. Mike could have committed the crime out of revenge, aligning with the theory that the attacker was someone Dana knew. When investigators traveled to Canada and spoke with Mike in person, they saw a man deeply affected by the loss of his loved one. He disclosed that he was already aware of the infidelity and had forgiven Dana. On the night of the crime, he couldn't reach Dana by phone. Displeased with how their last meeting ended, he decided to drive to her. Investigators were optimistic, thinking they finally had a breakthrough in the case with a suitable motive: jealousy. However, Mike continued his narrative, revealing that he was stopped by Border Patrol. They halted him, then turned him back because his driver's license had expired. This information was confirmed by Border Control. While investigators considered the possibility that Mike might have found another way to enter the States, they were beginning to realize that this was yet another dead end. All the likely suspects in Dana's murder had alibis. Frustrated after 5 months of investigation, the Washington police sought assistance from an FBI profiler to help them create a profile of the perpetrator. Notably, they hadn't completely ruled out Dana's husband Sam as a suspect at that point. However, the profiler confidently stated that Sam wasn't the one who killed his wife. If Sam had committed the crime, it would have been planned, and he would have used a weapon. Moreover, Sam could have easily devised an attack plan during the 2-hour drive from his home to hers. The crime wouldn't have occurred on a day when he had custody of the children. Even if it was an unplanned attack, there would have been bruises on Dana's face, because a man in a fit of rage would start with facial blows. Shocked by the news of Sam's innocence, the profiler asked if any of the people they interviewed displayed signs of remorse. He reminded the detectives that Dana knew her killer, and they were now searching for someone haunted by guilt. The police tried to look at the case from a different angle. It was then that they discovered something that matched this rather specific characteristic. In the book where guests could leave farewell messages at Dana's funeral, Amanda, her niece, left a rather interesting note. She apologized to her aunt for not being the best niece and wrote that she had been sober for 37 days, refraining from any prohibited substances. In principle, these words did not contain anything incriminating, especially considering that the girl had lost her beloved aunt, who had always been a friend and support to her. Nevertheless, there was something in them that made the investigators take a closer look at her. Amanda was invited to the police station for questioning. Now, with Dana, her protector, absent from her life, Amanda found herself in even worse company than before. The girl was genuinely devastated by Dana's murder and shared that her aunt had always been the person she could turn to when she had problems or when her relationship with her parents was strained. The police asked Amanda if she knew anyone who would go as far as to murder a woman who cared so much for her. They reminded her of how horrifying the last moments of her aunt's life were, possibly even showing her some images, and the girl broke down. She provided the police with the name of one of her friends, Blaine. Amanda told the police that Blaine had a violent temper and had once tried to push her onto the couch and assault her when she rejected his advances. She added that he had also been in Dana's house, and after her murder, he observed the crime scene from across the street while forensic experts worked. Furthermore, after her aunt's murder, she noticed scratches on his hands. Digging into Blaine's past, the police found that he had a history of various offenses. They were eager to talk to him, but there was a problem. Blaine had disappeared. He was living in a southern state, making extradition difficult, and he showed no willingness to cooperate voluntarily. Trying to find a way to question him, the detectives decided to start with interviewing his friends. This led them to his friend, who happened to be in jail at that time. When they explained that they wanted to question Blaine as a suspect in Dana Laskowski's murder, the friend exclaimed, "Wait, Blaine didn't kill Dana. Emily killed Amanda's aunt." Emily, Amanda's close friend who frequently visited Dana's house. The friend added that there was no doubt that Emily did it. They had long nicknamed her Mutant because of her inhuman strength. Emily could defeat anyone in arm wrestling, and her favorite move involved a grip that allowed her to practically choke her sparring partner. It was at this point that investigators realized they had overlooked a potential suspect who stood at only 158 centimeters tall and weighed 54 kilograms. The police brought Emily to the station. She was clearly not inclined to cooperate. She behaved overly confidently, was rude to the police, and when they listed all the witnesses pointing to her, she became furious and declared that she had nothing to do with the crime. She couldn't provide an alibi either. The police obtained a search warrant for her residence, where they found a blouse stolen from Dana. Apparently, Blaine's friends had pointed them to this detail. They revealed that Emily not only stole the blouse, but also appeared in it at Dana's funeral. In Emily's apartment, the police also found the girl's diary containing several intriguing entries. Firstly, Emily wrote about Amanda, stating that she could strangle that wretch, just like her aunt. Secondly, the girl had a to-do list for her life, and among the 10 various points, one stood out: kill someone and not get caught. These entries provided a kind of admission and motive, but the detectives understood that this was not sufficient for a confession. Moreover, any defense attorney could easily challenge such evidence. What a 17-year-old girl wrote in her diary might not be taken seriously in court. The police needed to get Amanda's confession. They invited the girl to the station again, this time directly accusing her of leading them astray several times and threatening to charge her as an accomplice. Under pressure, she revealed everything. On the evening of August 30th, when they went to her aunt with Emily, they were under the influence of illicit substances. The teenagers wanted to ask Dana for money, but Emily behaved strangely, rudely, and sharply towards the homeowner, forcing her to ask the girls to leave. Emily refused to leave. Then Dana gently touched the girl's shoulder to escort her to the door, but Emily suddenly became furious. She struck Dana on the head. Interestingly, this detail was not reported by the media, so Amanda could only have known it if she had truly witnessed the murder. After that, Emily applied a choking technique, just as Blaine's friends described. She used a scarf to strangle Dana, showing no intention of stopping. Amanda turned away, unable to watch what was happening. She heard a crunch, then wheezing, and finally, it became very quiet. Dana was dead. The girls took the money they could find and left. Amanda admitted that she did not expect everything to end this way. She thought Emily would simply anger Dana to the point where she would forbid them from coming to her home again. Detectives now understood that the crime was both an attack on a carefully chosen victim and a robbery. On the one hand, the girls needed money. On the other, Emily envied her friend's relationship with her aunt, and out of jealousy, she decided to get rid of Dana once and for all. On March 13, 2003, Emily Lonborg was charged with first-degree murder. She had already turned 18, and they were planning to try her as an adult. However, prosecutors were not confident they could secure a conviction. Emily did not confess to anything. The testimony of Amanda played a significant role, but it couldn't be relied upon since, upon seeing her friend in the defendant's seat, Amanda might retract her statements. If charges were brought against Amanda, she could invoke the right to remain silent. Even with Amanda's testimony, prosecutors were uncertain they could convince the jury that a petite teenage girl could strangle an adult woman with her bare hands. They made what was perhaps the right decision in this case. They negotiated a deal. Emily admitted guilt to involuntary manslaughter and received less than 7 years of imprisonment. Amanda was not charged. Justice, to some extent, prevailed. However, this case leaves a bitter taste because, in prison, Emily exhibited model behavior. Additionally, the time she spent in pre-trial detention was counted towards her sentence. Therefore, after just 5.5 years, she became a free person. She got married, changed her name, and became a mother. Emily Lonborg, who left 3 children without a loving mother, now enjoys the life she stole from her victim. What motive for murder would you consider the most trivial? Betrayal, jealousy, or money? Don't rush to answer. This is a tricky question. After all, a jealous person might turn out to be greedy, and an unfaithful wife may burn with jealousy herself. When in a love triangle, each person has their own motive for murder, it won't be easy for the police to figure it out. And then even a killer who no one would dare to call very smart will manage to lead the investigation for 467 days. Growing up in Amarillo, Texas, Robin knew exactly what she wanted in life, even as a child. She wanted to stay at home and take care of her children while her husband provided for the family. Her parents, both military veterans, had a happy marriage that lasted for 40 years, and she dreamed of having a similar relationship. However, things didn't go as planned because she often chose the wrong partners and avoided the good ones as if they were a danger. But above all, Robin feared being alone. She hated being alone, and she was afraid of being alone. Fortunately, thanks to her sociable nature, she got a job as a waitress in a restaurant where there was no shortage of attention from men. And so one evening in 2003, at the age of 22, Robin met a wonderful young man named Jeremy David Spielbauer, though everyone simply called him JD. 21-year-old JD was gentle, caring, and exceptionally polite. He served in the Marine Corps and had been deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. He also found work as a mechanic in civilian life. Needless to say, Robin fell head over heels in love with him. Just 2 months later, she joyfully announced to her parents that she and JD were expecting a child. Her parents had only just learned that she was dating someone, but they chose not to argue. Robin moved into JD's and his mother's house. After the birth of their daughter, they decided to get married. Soon, their second daughter was born. However, as is often the case, financial difficulties made life increasingly challenging for the growing family, and conflicts became inevitable. Then, to the surprise of their friends and family, the family began attending the local church about 3 times a week. There, they made new acquaintances, including a young mother of 2, Katie. The girls quickly became friends, but Robin's friend Aaron House looked with suspicion upon JD's newfound religious devotion. She believed that their church attendance was a more trivial reason, a desire to see Katie more often. Unfortunately, she was right. Robin stubbornly turned a blind eye to everything until the day her husband moved in with his lover. Approximately 8 years into their marriage, Robin filed for divorce and returned to live with her parents. JD and Katie got married on November 10th, the founding day of the Marine Corps. Now, JD helped Katie raise her 2 children, but it was clear that Robin hadn't forgotten her ex-husband until she became interested in Jared. It was evident that the young man genuinely liked Robin, and her friends, especially Aaron, were very happy for her. Robin at last regained her old self, rejoiced, and smiled happily, just like before. It seemed like a happy family and a cozy nest were on the horizon for the girl. But this glimmer of hope quickly dimmed one night in April 2014 when Robin got into her car and drove away, never to return home. On the morning of April 8, 2014, Robin's mother noticed her daughter was missing. She assumed that she had stayed with one of her friends, as she had done in the past, and felt somewhat irritated because she needed to go to work and didn't know who would take her grandchild to school. At that moment, it didn't even occur to her that something might have happened to her daughter. On the same day, around noon, a local businessman was driving on the highway when he turned onto Helium Road, and 3 girls ran towards him shouting, "She's dead! She's dead!" The man contacted the rescue service after the girls told him that they had seen a black Chevrolet Tahoe with a girl lying near the rear wheel. She wasn't breathing and wasn't moving. The officers who arrived at the scene concluded that the poor girl had been there for several hours and had suffered a blow to the head with a blunt object. She had no identification, wallet, or phone with her. However, the license plate of the vehicle helped identify the victim as Robin Spielbauer. Robin's parents had to break the terrible news to her daughters and her ex-husband. JD couldn't believe what had happened and couldn't hold back his tears. He immediately went to the family to support the children and his former in-laws. At the same time, the investigators were examining the crime scene. One unusual detail they noticed was the damage to the car's glass. The rear right door's glass had chips and bright pink paint marks. What did this suggest? It indicated that someone had struck the car's glass with a heavy and pink object. However, the detectives had no idea what significance this discovery would have in their investigation. Therefore, they began questioning Robin's acquaintances. Her boyfriend Jared stated that after work, he went home, played video games, and went to sleep. JD also claimed that he was at home, had 2 glasses of beer, and fell asleep. He hadn't come anywhere near Helium Road that evening and had no idea where Robin might have gone, why, or with whom. However, his phone told a completely different story. According to his text messages, he and his ex-wife were planning to meet that evening. The man had to admit that his wife had gone to her friend's place with their son. He had arranged to meet Robin at his home to discuss their children and wanted his uncle to be there in case his wife returned early. However, he forgot about the meeting and simply fell asleep on the couch after his uncle left. He woke up shortly before 10 p.m. with a strange, oppressive feeling. JD messaged his wife and his uncle, asking if everything was okay. At 10:18, he also messaged Robin, but she didn't respond. He tried calling her, but it went to voicemail. Just a few minutes after JD called his ex-wife, Katie arrived at the house. JD's uncle, who had returned to calm his agitated nephew, confirmed that she arrived around 10:20. They talked for a bit, as JD was still feeling uneasy. The detectives noticed that JD seemed to be trying to hint at something and directly stated that he was raising many suspicions. In response, the man claimed that he had his own suspicions but didn't specify what they were. The investigators had no doubt that JD was hiding something, and as they delved into his life, they discovered what it could be. JD had been married to Robin, but he had an affair with Katie. He then divorced Robin, married Katie, and started a new affair, this time with Robin. JD claimed they maintained friendly relations for the sake of the children, but Katie suspected there was more between him and his ex-wife. JD and Katie argued nearly every day, and Robin found it amusing. She wanted Katie to take her own medicine. The two women fought for a man they both considered a traitor, and what made him worth fighting for remained a mystery. Robin's friend Aaron even recalled an incident in 2013 when Robin came to Katie's house to pick up the girls. Katie grabbed and pushed her down the stairs, climbed on top, and started beating her. Robin managed to push her off. When Aaron heard about this, she warned her friend not to be alone with Katie because she was one of those crazies who could kill her. 5 months after that fight, Robin was dead. The investigators, of course, spoke with Katie. She admitted not liking Robin, but claimed she never threatened her. However, she stumbled on the same issue her husband did, her own text messages, and not just 1 or 2 messages. In the 4 days leading up to the murder, Katie sent her husband 336 angry messages. It was clear that she was furious and struggling to find a way to vent her anger. Less than an hour before the murder, she sent the following message to her husband. "My dreams of a happy family have evaporated. I won't force you to continue bearing this burden. You started it, whether you want to believe it or not. I will end it." Statements like these, in the eyes of the investigators, turned the jealous wife into a murder suspect. However, Katie had not only a motive, but also an alibi. She and her son spent the evening at her friend Savannah Guinness's house. They left around 10 p.m. and returned home at 10:20, which was confirmed by JD and his uncle. Furthermore, there was no evidence connecting her to the crime scene, at least not at that point. On the same day that investigators were interrogating Katie, the forensic expert conducted an autopsy on Robin. At the crime scene, it appeared that she had died from a severe blow to the head with a blunt object, but the autopsy revealed something more. A .22 caliber bullet had been fired into the back of the victim's head. Now the police began searching for the weapon. Robin's parents, who lived just a few houses away from Katie and JD, watched as the police conducted a search in their former son-in-law's home. The family had an entire arsenal in the house, which was quite common for Texas. However, one small detail caught a lot of attention. A pistol with a bright pink frame, the same caliber as the bullet that killed Robin. A piece of plastic had broken off the pistol. Therefore, the investigators returned to the crime scene and combed the area around where they found the car. They discovered a .22 caliber shell casing and 2 bright pink plastic fragments that obviously matched the pistol. What was particularly intriguing was that before they found the weapon, but after the murder, the investigators had browsed Katie's Facebook page and found a photo of her shooting the very same pink pistol. However, before they could realize the significance of this discovery, she deleted the photo. It seemed like Katie didn't want the police to know about the weapon. But why? Detectives took a closer look at where she was at the time of the murder. You may remember she had an alibi. She and her son spent the evening with Savannah's family and left at 10 p.m. However, Savannah told them that Katie and her son had left at 9:50 or around that time. Just 10 minutes, but they were crucial. It only takes from 3 to 5 minutes to drive from Savannah's house to Helium Road. These 10 minutes cast doubt on Katie's alibi, and her best friend was the one who brought it to light. There was more. At 10:13, Katie's phone pinged at a tower that could be considered close to both Savannah's house and the crime scene. This meant that Katie had the means, opportunity, and motive to commit the murder. The police believed they had everything they needed for an arrest. They arrested Katie in front of her 12-year-old son, Diego. By the way, as all witnesses confirmed, Katie was with her son the entire evening. Wouldn't he have noticed if his mother had stopped the car in the middle of a field, had an argument with someone, and then committed a murder? Especially since Robin had not only been shot, but also struck with a blunt object on the head. The teenager surely would have noticed. But when he was questioned, he said that all he remembered was sitting in the car with his mom and playing games on his phone while they drove around the city. Thus, on April 11, 2014, just 4 days after the murder, the investigators informed Robin's parents about the arrest. Robin's loved ones lost a daughter and a friend. But the consolation for them was that the person responsible for her death, Katie Spielbauer, was behind bars. Is the case closed? Not quite. Katie remained in jail, unable to post bail, while investigators and District Attorney James Farron built their case against her. They soon received assistance from an unexpected source. JD came to the police station and stated something he had maintained all along. He had been at home with his uncle when he received a message from Robin proposing a meetup on Helium Road. This time, JD added to his story by saying that just after 9 p.m., Katie returned home. She was in a bad mood and started an argument. JD, not wanting to fight, went to his bedroom and lay down. When he woke up, he found that his wife had left in his car. That was when a terrible feeling of dread overcame him, and he decided to check if everything was all right. JD and his uncle received responses from Katie, confirming everything was fine, but there was no response from Robin. When the detectives asked JD why he decided to tell them about this now, he explained that the thought of his wife being involved in Robin's murder was driving him insane. The investigators challenged JD's story, which contradicted phone records available to the police. JD's phone pinged at 9:23 while he was on his way to the crime scene. JD then explained that someone else had taken his phone and his car. It was Katie. She saw his messages with his lover and took his phone, his car, and went to confront Robin. But why did Katie hit the car's rear right window with a gun? The detectives were convinced that it was likely the lovers had met on Helium Road, sitting in the back seat of the car when Katie arrived. She fired her gun before JD could react, and now he was torn between his loyalty to Katie and his desire for justice for Robin. After a few more days, JD finally agreed to tell everything. JD and Robin had met on Helium Road, sitting in the car and just talking about the kids. When they noticed headlights approaching, they heard a loud knock on the window, obviously not made by a fist. JD opened the door, and it was Katie. The girls immediately started arguing. JD demanded they stop fighting and reassured Katie that they were just talking about the children. He then went to his car and drove home, convinced that Katie would follow him, but he was wrong, so he sent 2 text messages, asking if everything was okay. JD explained that he hadn't told anyone earlier because he didn't want to believe it, as he still loved Katie, but now it was all over. He filed for divorce and never visited his wife in jail, as she was going to be there for a long time unless she could prove her innocence. When investigators took on the case, it seemed simple and straightforward. It took them 4 days to link Katie to the murder. The prosecutor believed that after some time in jail, Katie would confess. However, even her husband's admission didn't help. Katie demanded a polygraph test. The police provided her with that opportunity and she took another one. She failed it miserably, but it didn't break her. She still refused to confess. Katie didn't deny her animosity towards her rival, but claimed she would never kill her or arrange someone else to commit murder. The reason lay in her tragic upbringing. Her father died when she was 2, and she buried her mother at 18. Knowing the hardships of growing up without parents, she would never do such a thing to Robin's children. All the evidence against Katie was circumstantial, and they needed something more solid. That's when a breakthrough happened. In the prosecutor's office, someone mentioned a case where smartphones could leave digital footprints when connecting to Wi-Fi networks. Katie's phone had its Wi-Fi turned off, but her son Diego's phone had it on. This meant that investigators could track Diego's every move and consequently that of his mother that night. Since all the witnesses consistently stated that the teenager was always with his mother, tracing Diego's phone could lead them to Katie. The prosecutor instructed his assistants to obtain this information, and it took months to do so. When the data was finally acquired, the prosecutor met with Katie. By that time, she had spent 467 days in jail awaiting trial. The prosecutor told Katie that he considered this information the final piece needed. He was confident that it would send her to prison for life, but it turned out to be the key to her freedom, allowing her to reunite with her children. She couldn't believe it, breaking down in tears due to the overwhelming emotions. She admitted that during her time in jail, she had harbored the darkest thoughts, fearing that if she were found guilty, she would have to be carried out in a body bag. She would prefer her children to believe their mother had passed away rather than having her incarcerated for murder. Suddenly, with the snap of fingers, she was free. Within hours, the case against her was closed, and she was released. A happy ending? Not quite, as if Katie was innocent. It meant that someone else got away with murder. The prosecutor publicly admitted his mistake. He realized that JD had outsmarted him simply because everyone underestimated him, believing he wasn't clever enough to orchestrate a murder. Although there was a small arsenal in his home, he chose the pink gun, which often jammed after the first shot, solely because it belonged to Katie. He could have disposed of it in the desert where it might never be found, but he brought it back home. Moreover, surveillance cameras captured a car similar to his near the crime scene at approximately the time of the murder. Although the face and license plate weren't visible, investigators were convinced it was J.D. behind the wheel, and no car remotely resembling Katie's was seen there. But the most significant lie he told was not about the night of the murder, but his past. J.D. had never served in the Marine Corps or any other military branch, nor had he been to Iraq or Afghanistan. All those stories were fabrications to impress women like Katie, whose parents had military ties, something that spoke volumes about his character. The prosecutor was certain that at some point before Robin's murder, she had told J.D. that she had met someone else and they would no longer be lovers. Additionally, she had expressed her desire to finally receive full child support payments. J.D.'s scheme was simple: kill Robin to get rid of her, frame Katie to eliminate her as well, and then remain financially stable while finding a younger and more agreeable girlfriend. This would solve all his problems. However, the prosecutor hesitated to press charges, and 9 months later, Robin's mother called him. It turned out J.D. had asked her to do him a favor and buy him a ticket to New York, claiming he needed to go there for the weekend. Presumably, he planned to flee since it was just a short distance from New York to the Canadian border. This prompted the prosecutor to take action, but an arrest doesn't equal a conviction. That's why he took another unexpected step by inviting Katie as a witness in the case. The prosecutor was confident that his earlier mistake would now help convict J.D. Robin was killed with a pink gun, and either J.D. or Katie had to be the murderer. It was certainly not Katie. The defense argued that if Robin had been severely beaten and then shot, it pointed towards Katie as the perpetrator because both actions could have killed her, suggesting the murderer was in a state of rage. Moreover, J.D. couldn't have framed Katie easily because he wasn't smart enough for such a plan. If he wanted to frame his wife, he would have ensured that she had no alibi. J.D. could have been sentenced to death if the jury believed that the crime included a robbery because Robin's phone and wallet went missing, and later, her daughter's documents were found in J.D.'s car. However, the jury decided that this was more likely a theft than a robbery. Therefore, he was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after April 20th, 2046, when he would be 63 years old. Justice was served for Robin, but her parents still felt the pain of the thought that their daughter's greatest fear came true when J.D. left her alone on that remote road. In January 2020, the case took an unexpected turn. The appellate court overturned J.D.'s conviction. It turned out that 2 jurors had formed opinions about the defendant and the case before the trial, which was not allowed by the procedure. Additionally, J.D. had complained about the performance of his lawyers. In 2021, the court found no issues with the jury selection process. However, the case was once again sent back to the appellate court to assess J.D.'s complaint about his attorneys. It's important to note that the appellate court did not conclude that the man was innocent, but rather that there was a procedural error. Even if J.D.'s trial is conducted again, Katie, who currently works at a law firm, has promised to be present on behalf of Robin to ensure that justice prevails once more. Katie herself has become the director of a company that helps teenagers and adults overcome emotional and physical traumas and change their lives for the better through sports. When the body of a teenage girl was found murdered, the tiny town of Wausau in Wisconsin was gripped by fear. Everyone worried they might be the next victim of the ruthless intruder. But if the motive was money, why didn't he take it? The stories of the suspects only puzzled the detectives further. They wondered, was this merely a show to conceal what was really happening behind closed doors? Or was it genuine grief over the loss of a loved one? Until they found a startling clue that could put the final nail in the killer's coffin. Saturday, May 2nd, 2009, began like any other day for the emergency services in the quiet town of Wausau, Wisconsin. Although it was expected to be an uneventful day, a call came in at 1:30 p.m. A woman reported that her neighbor had asked her to call an ambulance for his brother's girlfriend. She was lying on the floor of their apartment with a throat wound and cuts all over her body. The police officers dispatched to the scene hoped the woman was mistaken, as the situation often turns out to be less severe than the caller describes. But not this time. Several people were waiting for the officers in the parking lot of the apartment complex. One of them stepped forward and led them to the apartment. It was 19-year-old Hugo Ramirez. The young man could barely form sentences due to how much he was crying and shaking. Hugo was about to show the detectives what had shocked him so much. The officers would not soon forget this scene either. Entering the apartment, they walked through an unremarkable living room and kitchen and approached a small hallway. Hugo pointed to the bedroom at the very end on the left. Even before stepping into the room, the officers were stunned by the sight that met their eyes. The drying blood was everywhere, on the carpet, on the belongings, and of course, on the girl lying in the center of this bloody scene. Hugo informed them that the girl's name was Brianna Schneller. Brianna lay on her back, her mutilated face covered with a towel. There were deep wounds on her neck and across the upper part of her torso. Cuts on her arms indicated that she had fought for her life, but the killer had overpowered her. Now the police needed to hurry. Journalists were already surrounding the crime scene, and it was crucial that Brianna's loved ones did not learn of her death from the news. By the time the officers contacted the Schneller family, they already knew something had happened at the apartment where the girl lived and that someone had died. But they didn't know that Brianna was the victim. Her parents had been trying to reach her without success. They were informed of the news at the station. Afterward, they were asked to identify Brianna from photographs taken at the crime scene. Even after confirming it was her, her parents, Craig and Lori, and her brother Rocky, still couldn't believe what had happened. Despite their unspeakable sorrow, the family members tried to provide the police with as much information as possible about Brianna and the details of her life leading up to the murder. Craig and Lori explained that Brianna's life was much like that of her peers. She was finishing school, working part-time as a waitress in a restaurant, and enjoyed spending her free time with friends. She loved shopping, dancing, and music. Moreover, Brianna was looking forward to a trip to Tennessee that summer, where she was to present an important project for a renowned non-profit national organization of professional and technical student leaders. Brianna was the only person in the entire state of Wisconsin who met all the criteria to participate in this event. To the family, what had happened made no sense. As Craig explained, she didn't have a single enemy. Her relationship with her boyfriend, 22-year-old Sebastian Ramirez, Hugo's brother, was wonderful. The couple had met a couple of years ago and had been inseparable since. During this time, the parents had gotten to know the young man well. Naturally, they had concerns when Brianna decided to move in with him at 18. They worried that she was growing up too fast. But Sebastian truly loved their daughter, so they accepted her decision. After high school, she planned to pursue higher education in restaurant management and dreamed of opening a restaurant with Sebastian. She genuinely enjoyed working in the restaurant business, and she was loved by her colleagues and customers. The girl's parents also helped the police narrow down the time frame of the attack on Brianna. Her mother, Lori, was the last person to speak with Brianna a few hours before the body was discovered. That day, Lori had taken her daughter's car to the auto shop to fix the brakes and had texted her daughter at 10 a.m. Thus, the attack occurred sometime after Lori spoke with her daughter at 10 a.m. and before Hugo found her at 1:30 p.m. While the detectives were speaking with the girl's parents, forensic experts found several clues at the crime scene. First of all, an iron lying on the floor near Brianna caught their attention. Various parts of it were scattered on the floor, and there was blood on the iron, suggesting the killer might have used it as a weapon. In the bathroom sink were 2 knives, one of which was missing its sharp tip. Blood was found on a bar of soap nearby, indicating that the killer had taken the time to wash the knives and their hands, but had missed leaving a bloody shoe print on the mat. Further examination of the apartment revealed 2 more interesting points. First, there were no signs of forced entry, and second, nothing seemed to be missing. This was especially curious because cash was scattered throughout the apartment. Various bills ranging from $1 to $20 added up to a considerable sum. If a robber had broken in for money, they would have taken it. Thus, the evidence at the crime scene indicated that Brianna herself was the target of the attack. The autopsy confirmed this conclusion. The most crucial information the medical examiner shared with the detectives was that the girl had fought for her life, and the killer's DNA likely remained under her nails. Skin samples found under her nails were sent for analysis. Overall, the autopsy confirmed what the investigators already suspected. The attack was unprecedented in its brutality and the attacker's fury. Brianna had been struck on the head with a blunt object, likely the iron found near her body. The attacker also slashed her throat with a knife and inflicted so many stab wounds that the pathologist couldn't accurately count them. The knife wounds were particularly severe, and at least 2 of them were fatal enough to kill her within a minute. The tip of one of the knives found in the sink was discovered in one of her wounds. Usually, such a savage attack indicates that the killer must have felt uncontrollable rage towards the victim to inflict so many injuries. But who could have harbored such strong feelings toward Brianna? The police knew of at least one person they needed to speak with immediately. Sebastian was brought to the station along with his brother, but they were placed in separate interrogation rooms so their statements could be compared later. Sebastian explained that he woke up around 9:15 a.m., an hour before he was due at the Mexican restaurant where he and his brother worked. The restaurant, El Tequila Salsa, was about 3 kilometers from the apartment, a 10-minute drive. The young man took a shower and chatted with Brianna, as she didn't need to go to school on Saturdays. Hugo had overslept, so his brother had to wake him up just before leaving the house at 10 a.m. By 10:15 a.m., Sebastian was already at work and was there when he received the call informing him about what had happened to his girlfriend. Hugo's story began much like his brother's version. After being woken up by his brother, he quickly got ready and left the house 15 minutes after Sebastian. Nothing unusual happened at work. At 1:20 p.m., Hugo went on a break and drove home to take a short nap. Entering the apartment, he initially didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. He walked down the hallway and into his room, but he soon felt uncomfortable as if something was wrong. That's when he noticed that Sebastian's room door was open. Hugo peeked inside and to his horror saw Brianna lying on the floor. Rushing over, Hugo started shouting her name, begging her to get up, to wake up, but she didn't respond. Only then did he notice how much blood there was in the room. He tried to dial 911, but his mind suddenly stopped working and his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't even press the buttons. He then ran downstairs, where through his panic he tried to explain to a neighbor that they needed to call for help. The young men seemed genuinely devastated by what had happened. Investigators wanted to believe them, but they knew they needed evidence to confirm their innocence. It was possible they were simply excellent actors, or were hiding remorse beneath a mask of grief and pain. Since both brothers' stories were identical, detectives considered the possibility that one of them committed the crime and the other was covering for him. In such a scenario, Sebastian seemed to have a potential motive to kill Brianna. Officers questioned the brothers about their relationship with Brianna, whether there were any issues, quarrels, or jealousy. Sebastian categorically denied any problems and stuck to his story. Brianna was the love of his life, and they were looking forward to a happy future together. Hugo was questioned with even greater scrutiny, especially after it was revealed he was supposed to work until 3 p.m. that day, but had changed his break time with a colleague due to a hangover, wanting to go home and rest. Detectives wanted to know if anything had happened between him and Brianna. Were there arguments? Perhaps Hugo also had romantic feelings for her, but Sebastian proved to be a more successful rival. However, Hugo vehemently denied this. Brianna was like a sister to him. He knew how deeply she and Sebastian loved each other, and he would never stand in their way. These interrogations continued for hours, but no matter what the police asked, Hugo and Sebastian stood by their stories. However, the brothers were able to clarify the issue of the scattered money found throughout the apartment. It was Hugo's tips. Previously, he used to carefully count all the money, but lately he had become lazy. When he came home, he simply emptied his pockets wherever, always promising himself to deal with it later. After obtaining DNA samples from the brothers, they were released, but in the eyes of the detectives, they remained the only suspects in Brianna's murder. Therefore, their next task was to either confirm or disprove the brothers' testimonies. Colleagues from the Mexican restaurant El Tequila Salsa confirmed that the young men were at work. Moreover, the restaurant had surveillance cameras, including ones that recorded the kitchen area. After reviewing the footage, the police confirmed that Sebastian arrived at work first at 10:13 a.m. and did not leave until after Brianna's body was discovered. Hugo arrived at work a few minutes later and took his break at 1:20 p.m., just as he had stated. At the same time, the detectives were following another lead. Their conclusion that nothing had been stolen from the apartment had been hasty. Although the money and valuables were indeed left behind, the police had not found Brianna's phone. Like any teenage girl, Brianna always kept her phone with her. Moreover, she had exchanged messages with her mother at 10 a.m., so she definitely had it with her before the murder. This greatly interested the police, as the phone could contain something crucial to solving her murder. Therefore, the detectives made finding the phone their priority. They contacted Brianna's service provider. The phone company pinged the device and not only found that it was on, but also pinpointed its exact location. The detectives took one look at the address and were stunned. They knew this place. More than that, they had just been there. The phone was located near the El Tequila Salsa restaurant where the brothers Sebastian and Hugo worked. The detectives rushed to the location to find and seize the device as quickly as possible. Upon arrival, they realized that the coordinates were not for the restaurant itself, but for the parking lot of the shopping center where the restaurant was located. The police soon narrowed down the search area to the section where the dumpsters were. The detectives were reluctant to sift through all the garbage bags and had a simple yet brilliant idea. They called the phone, opening the dumpsters one by one. Finally, they heard the ringtone. Carefully moving the contents of the dumpster, the officers saw a light-colored bag through which the phone's screen light was visible. The bag contained several items, not just the phone. The police were eager to open it, but had to send it to the lab first because it could have DNA on it, especially on the top where someone had carefully twisted it closed. However, the detectives could already make one conclusion. This was not an ordinary bag, but a bag with the logo of the El Tequila Salsa restaurant, which customers used for takeout orders. The circle around the brothers was tightening more and more. Of course, they seemed to have an alibi, but the investigators couldn't believe that anyone else had committed the murder. Moreover, the pathologist couldn't determine the exact time of the girl's death to the minute. What if the crime happened a little earlier than they assumed? The girl had communicated with her mother at 10 a.m. Immediately after that, one of the brothers, or even both, killed Brianna, quickly got ready, and showed up at work at 10:15 a.m. Then they threw the bag with the evidence into the trash bin near the restaurant, hoping no one would find it. After the forensic experts collected DNA samples from the bag, it could finally be opened. Inside, in addition to Brianna's phone, there were warm gloves, but from different pairs, with one of them stained with blood, and also women's underwear, 2 pairs of panties. The investigators had expected anything, but not this. They had more questions than answers. According to Sebastian, the underwear belonged to Brianna. One of the gloves likely had been taken from the apartment as well. However, these items contradicted all the theories the detectives had been considering. If Hugo or Sebastian had committed the crime, it would be absurd for them to take the girl's underwear. But Sebastian and Hugo did not kill the girl. After examining Brianna's phone, investigators saw that her last conversation was not with her mother, but with a friend. Brianna sent her last message at 10:23, when the brothers had already definitely arrived at the restaurant, as confirmed by surveillance cameras. The entire investigation turned upside down. The police had never considered any other suspects besides the Ramirez brothers, but it turned out that both were completely innocent. So, who was the killer? And why did they dispose of the bag with evidence right near the El Tequila Salsa restaurant? Now, the detectives had to add a multitude of names to their list of suspects, employees and patrons of the El Tequila Salsa restaurant. They considered it highly unlikely that someone unrelated to the restaurant killed Brianna, collected incriminating evidence, and disposed of it right near the restaurant. Therefore, they first reviewed the list of employees, and one name caught their attention: Luciano Sanchez Ramos. The young man worked as a dishwasher at the restaurant and lived in the same building as Brianna. But most importantly, he was home on the morning of the murder. He arrived at work half an hour after Brianna sent her last message to her friend. When the police brought him in for questioning, he did not show much willingness to talk. Perhaps this was due to his immigration status or just a general distrust of the police. Nevertheless, he agreed to provide a DNA sample. The detective asked if anyone could verify his alibi, even partially. Luciano said there was someone, his colleague, the restaurant's cook Raul, who gave him a ride to work. The police spoke with Raul, who confirmed that he picked up Luciano. Raul honked his horn, and within a couple of minutes, Luciano came out of the house, behaving as usual. The investigators wanted some reliable confirmation of this and hoped that surveillance cameras might reveal what Luciano did that morning. Did he really just go to work at 11 a.m., or did he stop by the dumpster to dispose of the evidence? Unfortunately, all the restaurant's cameras filmed only inside the establishment. However, there was a gas station across from the dumpsters that had its own surveillance cameras. The quality of the footage left much to be desired, and the dumpsters were far from the gas station. Still, these videos provided invaluable help to the investigation. On May 9th, the police finally finished reviewing all the footage from the restaurant and the parking lot where the dumpsters were located. Individually, these videos were not very useful, but when the detectives correlated the timestamps, they obtained a much clearer picture of what had happened. At 1:16 p.m., one person exited through the restaurant's back door. Simultaneously, only one person approached the dumpster. It was 22-year-old restaurant cook Raul Ponce Rocha. He threw away the trash, quickly returned to the restaurant kitchen, and washed his hands. What was even more interesting was that Raul was the only one who left the restaurant during the time frame when Brianna's murder was committed. At 10:21 a.m., just a few minutes after the Ramirez brothers arrived at work, he exited through the back door to go pick up Luciano and returned at 10:56 a.m. Notably, he left wearing a brown hoodie but returned without it. He confirmed that he and Luciano did not make any stops on their way back to work. The detectives asked him why he was gone for 35 minutes, when the trip to pick up Luciano should have taken a maximum of 20 minutes. Where did the extra 15 minutes go? Raul was surprisingly stubborn and did not attempt to explain. The detective then asked about the cuts on his hands. Raul explained that as a cook, he frequently handled knives and had cut himself about 3 weeks ago, although the cuts looked fresh. While the investigators were confident that they had the right suspect, one question continued to trouble them. Why did Raul attack Brianna, and with such brutality? After all, he barely knew her. The Ramirez brothers had always treated him well, considering him a jovial fellow who often told funny stories and never had any quarrels with them. But detectives soon found the answer to this question. The police had enough evidence to obtain a DNA sample from Raul and a search warrant for the house where he lived with his parents and brothers. To prevent him from fleeing, they detained him based on his illegal immigration status. During the search of his bedroom, police found a glove that matched the one found in the dumpster, a sweatshirt with strands of hair that could belong to Brianna, and, finally, under the mattress, several adult videos and 4 pairs of women's panties. Everything fell into place when officers remembered Brianna's mother Lori's words about how she had taken her daughter's car to the auto repair shop that day. On the morning of May 2, 2009, Raul arrived at the restaurant around 9 a.m. On his way, he passed by the house where the girl lived and noticed that her car was not in its usual spot. He made a fatal mistake, assuming she wasn't home. Knowing that Hugo and Sebastian would soon arrive for work, he decided it was a perfect opportunity to add to his modest collection and steal something from Brianna's belongings. Just minutes after the Ramirez brothers arrived for work, Raul left, got into his car, and under the pretext of picking up Luciano, headed to the girl's house. He didn't immediately signal Luciano and instead went into the apartment where the brothers and Brianna lived. The lock on the apartment door was not very secure and could easily be opened with a plastic card. He entered the apartment. If the girl had caught him in the act, Raul could have claimed he was looking for the brothers and that the door was open. But most likely, the girl caught him stealing her underwear. Realizing she could identify him, Raul panicked, first hitting her with an iron and then slashing her throat with a knife, inflicting several other wounds. Detectives speculate that he began to derive pleasure from the process. Otherwise, it's unclear why he would strike her multiple times with 2 knives. After the murder, he quickly tried to clean up and took the evidence with him, as he still needed to pick up Luciano. He then returned to work as if nothing had happened and disposed of the evidence packet. All doubts about Raul's involvement disappeared when the lab results arrived. His DNA was found on the knife, the packet, the gloves, the iron, and under Brianna's fingernails. The hair on his sweatshirt also belonged to the victim. Furthermore, a blood-stained shoe print in the bathroom matched the size and pattern of Raul's shoes that he wore on the day of the murder. Raul was charged with Brianna's murder. The trial began in 2011. Initially, during interrogations, Raul claimed he had never spoken to Brianna and never entered the house where she lived. However, by the start of the trial, his story changed. Despite almost pinning the murder on Sebastian and Hugo, Raul showed no remorse and decided to accuse an innocent third person of the crime. He claimed that he had entered the apartment but left, leaving behind his colleague Sergio Juarez Gutierrez, who Brianna was discussing something with in another room. This statement could have planted doubts in the minds of the jurors because Sergio hastily left for Mexico, and Raul's lawyers were confident they wouldn't be able to question him. However, the police managed to contact Sergio in Mexico, and he was not pleased to hear that his name had been dragged through the mud. He returned for the trial and proved that he was nowhere near Brianna on the day of the murder. Sergio had returned to Mexico shortly before the murder to take care of his father, who had cancer. No one expected Sergio to appear in court, and it was a serious blow to the defendant's defense. It took the jurors only 90 minutes to find Raul guilty of first-degree murder, robbery, and theft. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Thus, a young woman lost her life due to a tragic mistake. Raul did not enter the apartment with the intention of killing her. But why did he choose murder instead of being charged with unlawful entry? Was he afraid of being deported? That everyone would find out about his collection? Or did he simply not realize the consequences of his actions? Did he cover Brianna's face with a towel, unable to face what he had done? Brianna's father admitted that he wanted to talk to Raul, perhaps to ask him all these questions. However, Raul declined his offer to meet. He never took responsibility for the crime. His decision was based solely on the assumption that Brianna wasn't home. After the trial, Lori Schneller said that the verdict wouldn't bring back her daughter, but would allow them to live on. "We are glad that justice was served for her," she said. "I don't know if there will ever be a day like before, but it has become a little easier after the verdict." Monday, May 2nd, 2005, the police station in the French town of Egmore. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, an officer answered a call that seemed strange to him, to say the least. On the line was an informant claiming that something terrible might happen to a young woman in a few hours. The informant explained that a couple was sitting at a table on the terrace of the Laskowski bar in Egmore, and the police needed to act immediately because her companion was extremely dangerous. The officer who answered the call heard a panicked voice on the other end shout, "The man who just left me is planning to abduct a girl. He's dangerous, and I think he's going to do something terrible." The caller was 63-year-old local resident Dominique Tarasco. Tarasco's voice trembled as he told the police about a conversation he had with a friend earlier that day. His friend was a cruel and dangerous man, and from their conversation, Tarasco deduced that he intended to harm a young girl. The police tried to obtain more information from Dominique, what his friend looked like, his name, who they should be looking for. However, despite his initial willingness to help, Tarasco refused to reveal his friend's name, stating that he feared for his own life. No promise of protection could compel him to disclose the name. However, he did provide the police with the location where his friend was supposed to meet. He said his friend would meet an unsuspecting girl on the terrace of the Laskowski bar. Tarasco also gave the police a description of his friend's car, a green 1994 Seat Ibiza. Time was running out rapidly. If an abduction was planned, the police didn't have time to extract more information from Tarasco. 4 officers got into 2 cars and immediately headed to the bar. They arrived at the establishment around 6:15 p.m. The police turned off their sirens and pretended to be just enjoying themselves at the bar. It was crucial not to spook the suspect. However, they quickly realized that trying to find unknown abductors and the girl was nearly impossible. It was the last evening of a 3-day weekend, and the streets, as well as the bar's terrace, were crowded with couples having a good time. None of the girls appeared frightened. Not knowing whom to look for, 2 officers started scanning for the Seat Ibiza. An hour passed, but the police couldn't find the couple or the car. Detectives began to wonder if Dominique had been mistaken. They called him to clarify the details he had provided. Suddenly, Dominique's heart sank. He realized that he had described the wrong car. In reality, his friend drove a gray 1994 Citroën ZX. The police were incredibly frustrated that they had been searching for the wrong vehicle while the Citroën might have slipped right under their noses, and they wouldn't even have noticed. After another thorough search, they confirmed that they couldn't see the needed car anywhere. The race against time to save the girl came to a forced halt. The police were at a dead end. Since Dominique refused to provide more information, there was nothing they could do. The officers returned to the station and checked if there were any reports of missing local girls, but there were none. Dominique had given the police incomplete and inaccurate information. A logical question arises. Why did they believe him in the first place? Dominique Tarasco was known to the local police. Officially, he was involved in collecting recyclables, but unofficially, he was the owner of an illegal nightclub near Egmore. The seemingly simple wooden shed housed a popular establishment frequented by both local celebrities and less reputable individuals. The police wanted to shut down the illegal club, but Tarasco managed to strike a deal with them. He had become a police informant, and in exchange, law enforcement turned a blind eye to his business. Tarasco had already been of great use to the police, providing them with information about impending crimes that had led to several arrests. However, none of these cases had been as serious as a human abduction. 2 days later, a 25-year-old man named Sylvain Rosin walked into the police station in Marseille, 180 kilometers from Aigues-Mortes. Sylvain was extremely worried as he had been unable to contact his wife, Elod Morel, for 2 days. She had left home to meet with a well-known photographer in Aigues-Mortes. Sylvain explained that 28-year-old Elodie had worked as a waitress in bars and restaurants for most of her life, but she had grown tired of long night shifts, unpredictable working hours, low pay, and difficult customers. Given her interest in the fashion industry and natural beauty, she decided to pursue her long-standing dream of becoming a model. In April 2005, she registered on a website for people aspiring to work in the fashion industry. Elodie applied for any modeling job she could find, and then she came across an incredibly enticing offer. Renowned photographer Nicole Forestier was looking for models to represent Rolls-Royce. The photo shoot was scheduled to last for 5 days, and the 3 selected models would receive €1,000 for each shooting day, with expenses for food, accommodation, and transportation covered. Furthermore, the girls who impressed would travel to the United States as representatives of Rolls-Royce. This was Elodie's dream job, and she understood that her chances were slim with fierce competition ahead. Nevertheless, she submitted her application to participate in the competition. Prepared for rejection, she was overjoyed when Nicole wrote to her, informing her that she had secured the job. The photographer explained that Elodie had precisely the look she was seeking. When Sylvain heard that Elodie had been chosen as one of the 3 models for the photo shoot, her enthusiasm became infectious, although he did wonder if this could be a trap set by people preying on young, attractive girls. The police asked Sylvain why he allowed his wife to meet with the photographer in the first place, and he replied that he trusted his wife, who was an intelligent woman and would not fall for a foolish trick. Moreover, he felt that a meeting with a woman in a public place in the middle of the day couldn't hold any danger. The last message Sylvain received from his wife came on May 2nd at 9:30 p.m., a few hours after her meeting with the photographer. It read, "Kisses, everything is going fine. I'll call you tomorrow when I can. Kisses and hugs, we'll talk later." While the police spoke with Sylvain, they sensed that he might be hiding something. He tried to evade their questions, but eventually confessed that he and his wife had been arguing frequently recently and had even decided to separate, although they continued living together for the sake of their son. The police believed that the couple's relationship and Elodie's last message suggested that she might have chosen not to contact her husband voluntarily. However, Sylvain insisted that there was no reason for his wife to conceal a new romance, if there was one, and that she would never, ever abandon their son. She had always wanted their son to grow up in a loving family, something she herself had lacked in her childhood. The police had no doubts that there could be a million innocent reasons why the young woman hadn't been in touch with her husband. Perhaps she had no cell phone signal, or she had lost her phone. However, Sylvain insisted that something needed to be done. Finally, the Marseille police relented, compiled a report with Elodie's description and where she was last seen, and sent it to other police stations. The police in Aigues-Mortes continued to investigate missing persons reports, hoping to find any connection to the story Dominique Tarasco had shared 2 days earlier. When a fax arrived from the Marseille police detailing Elodie Morel's disappearance, the detectives couldn't help but feel uneasy. Elodie's last known location was Aigues-Mortes on May 2nd, and she had a meeting with an unknown individual at a bar around 6 p.m. The remarkable similarities between Elodie's disappearance and Dominique's potential abduction report couldn't be ignored. Detectives got in touch with Sylvain to gather more information about his wife. When Sylvain described the details of his wife's meeting with the photographer, they matched exactly what the police already knew from Dominique's account. These were the 2 pieces of the same story. Detectives asked Sylvain to come to the Aigues-Mortes police station and bring photos of his spouse. He also provided a description of his wife's car, the clothes she had taken with her, copies of Elodie's correspondence with Nicole Forestier, and his wife's phone number. Calls to the phone were immediately redirected to voicemail, indicating that the phone was either turned off or malfunctioning. However, the police managed to trace the ping from Elodie's phone and determined her location before her mobile went dead. On May 2nd, her phone was in Egmort, confirming that she had safely arrived in the city on that day. Later, she was located in the commune of Saint-Gilles, which is 30 kilometers from Egmort. This indicated that Elodie was likely on her way to the photo shoot location. Strangely, the signal then came from Vauvert, which is 19 kilometers in the opposite direction. Shortly after appearing in Vauvert, the ping from Elodie's phone disappeared and never reappeared. The police believed that they couldn't conduct a search in Egmort, Saint-Gilles, and Vauvert all at once. The area was too extensive. Only one person could help them now, Dominique Tarasco. They asked him to come to the station. He arrived around 8:30 p.m. and shared a story with the detectives that sent shivers down their spines. It was hard for them to believe. On the evening of May 2nd, after Tarasco had called the police to report a possible abduction, he drove into town to have dinner and distract himself from his thoughts. A few hours later, he was returning home along a country road. In the darkness, he noticed flashing blue and red lights. 2 police cars were blocking the road and several officers were standing nearby. Tarasco assumed that the police were conducting a stakeout on the potential kidnapper. He stopped his car and got out to inquire about the progress of the search for the girl. Although he had not disclosed the name of the potential abductor to the detectives, Tarasco hoped that the police had located the man's car. Meanwhile, the officers observed an agitated man approaching them, waving his arms and shouting strange questions. When he got closer, they could tell that he was slightly intoxicated. The man was asking whether they had found the car, arrested the suspect, and if the girl was okay, but the police couldn't make sense of his words. They didn't understand what he was talking about because they were simply conducting a routine check on cars passing along that road. While Tarasco was talking to the police, a car slowly approached them. Dominique instantly recognized the vehicle. It was his friend's gray Citroën ZX from 1994. It was his friend's car. As the officers were preoccupied with Dominique, the car drove past the police vehicles and sped away without being stopped. Tarasco noticed his friend in the driver's seat, and a beautiful, long-haired girl was sitting in the passenger seat. She seemed to be leaning against the window as if asleep. Dominique became extremely uneasy. He began demanding that the police chase after the car and arrest the driver, but they were no longer listening to him. Suddenly, the man's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and saw that it was his friend, who had just driven past him. Dominique's heart sank, but he managed to answer the call. As it turned out, his friend hadn't noticed him. Instead, he called to warn Dominique about the police presence near his home, advised him to be careful, and then ended the call. When Tarasco recounted this incredible story at the police station, the investigators were shocked. They found it hard to believe. What were the chances that Tarasco had approached the roadblock and effectively distracted the police just as his friend happened to drive by? And why was he only sharing this information now? Tarasco explained that he was terrified of his friend. With a certain degree of skepticism, the investigators contacted the officers who had been conducting the vehicle check that day and managed to confirm that there had indeed been a roadside check that evening. Someone had called Dominique after the gray Citroën ZX had passed by. Everything Tarasco had said was verified. He was telling the truth. His description of the girl in the car perfectly matched Elodie Morel. There was also no doubt about the identity of the driver of the car since Tarasco's friend had called him to warn about the police, and their patience had worn thin. They demanded a name. The investigators threatened Tarasco with imprisonment and pressed him to reveal the identity. Unable to withstand the pressure any longer, Tarasco finally gave in. Tearfully, he uttered the name of the abductor, Guillaume Mingaud. Guillaume Mingaud, 49 years old, had a long history of brushes with the law. He was known for hunting young foreign women traveling by car for his vile purposes. After his release from prison, he visited an old acquaintance and asked for a job. This acquaintance turned out to be Dominique Tarasco. Dominique had no desire to employ such a dangerous person, but fearing Mingaud himself, he hired him as a bouncer in his nightclub, where his violent nature could serve some purpose. On May 2nd, Mingaud was at Tarasco's establishment, where he boasted about having a meeting with a beautiful girl on the bar's terrace. However, Guillaume's choice of words unsettled Tarasco. Knowing Mingaud's proclivities, he felt obliged to inform the police about the impending encounter between a dangerous repeat offender and an unsuspecting girl. Learning of Mingo's criminal history, the police immediately classified him as the prime suspect. However, the case was still based on Tarasco's vague statements and could be dismissed as a series of unlikely coincidences. Detectives needed evidence of Elodie's abduction by Guillaume Mingo. They questioned the bar staff, who confirmed that Mingo was a regular customer and had arrived with a beautiful girl that day. It became increasingly evident that Elodie Morel was in the hands of a very dangerous individual capable of anything. Yet, the detectives had no idea where to find the suspect. Mingo had traveled extensively, often staying with acquaintances or spending nights in nightclubs. He could be anywhere. Therefore, they set up a trap to lure him. Detectives forced Dominique to call Mingo and arrange a meeting. Mingo told Dominique that he would be at a nightclub in Montpellier, a 30-minute drive from Aigues-Mortes. The club was familiar to Mingo as he had once worked there as a bouncer. Officers positioned themselves in the club's parking lot and waited. The plan worked. A white van pulled up, and to the police's surprise, Guillaume Mingo was indeed in the passenger seat. An unknown middle-aged man was driving, but was Elodie inside? Mingo got out of the car and the police immediately moved to apprehend the suspect. The man tried to flee, but they quickly brought him down and arrested him. The driver of the van didn't resist. He introduced himself as Richard Lignier, a nearby resident and construction worker. He had never had any legal troubles and simply wanted to spend a pleasant evening with his acquaintance. The police searched the van, but it turned out to be empty. Elodie was not inside. Mingo's belongings were also searched. In his pockets, they found a phone, car keys, and a wallet. Inside the wallet were some documents, a small amount of money, and a bank card in Elodie Morel's name. However, the man had a ready explanation. He claimed he had found the card on the bar's terrace 2 days ago and intended to return it to the bank the following day, but forgot to do so. As for Lignier, he explained that he lived in the commune of Vergese with his wife and teenage daughter. Mingo had been his friend, and for the past 2 days he had been staying at his house. Mingo allegedly often stayed with Lignier during his travels before setting out again. The detectives had a hard time believing the two men's stories. Mingo's explanation about Elodie's bank card seemed far-fetched, and Lignier lived only 8 kilometers from Vouvray, where the last ping from Elodie's mobile phone had been recorded. The police arrested both men and took them to the station for questioning. However, they made a stop on the way, visiting Richard Lignier's home. When the officers arrived at Lignier's house, they encountered the most bizarre and surreal scene of their careers. Richard's wife, Francine Lignier, and their daughter were seated at the table, having lunch. Neither Francine nor the girl reacted to the uninvited guests at all. They continued to eat in silence, as if a group of police officers had not just burst into their home and started searching the premises. This strange reaction left the detectives astounded, as if they had been expected. An unpleasant and oppressive atmosphere pervaded the family's home. Despite this eerie atmosphere, the police meticulously searched the house while the women continued their meal. Elodie herself was nowhere to be found, but indirect evidence of her presence emerged. A black handbag, a floral dress, 2 pairs of high-heeled shoes, and a black sweater. These were the items Elodie had taken with her on her trip. However, the most crucial piece of evidence was Elodie's phone, which was now in the possession of Lignier's daughter. After making these findings, the police decided to take the mother and daughter to the station for further questioning. Interrogating Mingo proved to be incredibly challenging. He was a master of manipulation and stuck to his story. The police could contradict some of his statements thanks to the evidence they had found, but Mingo insisted that he had simply found the bank card and intended to return it. Period. So the investigators decided to focus more on the Lignier family. They reasoned that it would be easier to get Richard, who had never been in trouble with the law before, to talk than the repeat offender Guillaume Mingo. With each passing hour of questioning, Richard became more exhausted, and the investigators were confident that he was on the verge of revealing everything. As expected, Richard eventually broke down. He confessed that Guillaume Mingo had shown up at his house at 6 a.m. on May 3rd while his family was having breakfast. Mingo claimed to have come with a girl and needed somewhere to hide her. Just a few meters from Richard's house, there was an isolated place, a garage. Richard had no choice but to unlock it and allow Mingo to drive into the garage. "I didn't see what was in the trunk. I didn't hear anything." Mingod said he would stay overnight in the garage to make sure she wouldn't scream. Richard asked no further questions, returned to the house, washed up, got dressed, and went to work as usual. But it wasn't an ordinary day. There was a young woman in his garage who could be in great danger. Richard was well aware of how cruel and dangerous Mingod could be, but not once throughout the entire day did he feel the need to contact the police and report what was happening in his garage. After Richard's confession, his wife Francine fully corroborated his account. However, like her husband, she never considered calling the police to report the girl in her garage. She was afraid that by doing so, Mingod would harm her daughter. She added that on the evening of the same day, May 3rd, Mingod entered their house, demanding dinner. He had with him a black bag, a dress, 2 pairs of high-heeled shoes, a sweater, and a phone. He handed the items to Richard and Francine as a gift. Francine took the items without asking questions, while she gave the phone to their daughter, as she happened to need a new one. During lunch, Mingod first mentioned that the girl might report him to the police and hinted at his terrible intentions toward her. Upon learning that Ligné had revealed everything to the police, Guillaume Mangot lost confidence in himself and came up with a new version of events. He admitted to posting a fake message online about upcoming photo shoots for Rolls-Royce. He had posed as the renowned photographer Nicole Forestier and provided enough information to make the photo shoot appear credible. Mingod claimed to be genuinely surprised when Elodie responded to the offer and accused her of falling for an offer that was too good to be true. Regardless, Mingod contacted Elodie by phone, introduced himself as Forestier's assistant Alain Lacoste, and invited her to Aigues-Mortes ostensibly to meet Forestier before the shoot began. After meeting Elodie, he proposed going on a trip to the locations where the photo shoot was planned. She agreed and messaged her husband, assuring him that everything was fine. As he had done in the past, Mingod drove Elodie onto a country road. Sensing that they had gone far enough, he attacked her. However, he told the police that all he needed was her bank card and PIN. He claimed that he simply let her go afterward, using her card to make some purchases, refuel his car, and withdraw some cash. This was confirmed by the ATM camera. Mingod denied Ligné's claims about the garage and other things. Of course, no one believed that Mingod had lured Elodie to Aigues-Mortes just to steal her bank card. While interrogating him, investigators searched Ligné's garage and found several dozen cigarette butts, fingerprints, and DNA evidence from both Guillaume and Elodie. These pieces of evidence confirmed that Elodie had been in the garage with Mingod. Confronted with these facts, Mingod provided yet another version of what happened. He once again claimed that he only needed Elodie's bank card. Supposedly, he did take her to the garage, but it was only to buy some time. He wanted to discuss a plan with Elodie. He would keep her bank card in exchange for her silence. Mingod stated that he was almost ready to release her when she suddenly pushed him. He justified the subsequent violence with his explosive temper. The end of the first week of May was supposed to be the grand finale of the photo shoot for Rolls-Royce. Instead, on May 6th, Mingod was wrapping up his statements about what had occurred. He revealed where he had left Elodie. The police found her black 1995 BMW sedan in the Aigues-Mortes parking lot. The license plates confirmed that it was her car. When detectives opened the trunk, they found Elodie there. She had died from asphyxiation. During the autopsy, more horrifying details of what had happened to Elodie during the harrowing 36 hours she spent in the clutches of her captor, with no one coming to her aid, were uncovered. There's no need to enumerate these details, as one can easily imagine what a criminal of this nature could do to an attractive young woman who had fallen into his trap. Guillaume Mangot, Richard, and Francine Ligné faced trial in January 2008. During the trial, Mangot once again mocked the feelings of all Elodie's friends and family. Despite all the evidence gathered and his own confession, he claimed that everything was Richard Ligné's fault and that he had fallen in love with Elodie at first sight, so he allegedly couldn't harm her. No one bought into his lies, and in February 2008, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. He filed an appeal which was approved. His sentence was reduced to a maximum of 30 years with a minimum of 20 years in prison. Richard and Francine were initially sentenced to 6 years, but their prison terms were increased to 8 years after a year. Sylvain Racine struggled deeply with what happened to his wife and never publicly commented on the case.
Elodie's top priority had been to raise her son in a safe and happy home environment, and Sylvain promised himself that he would do everything possible to ensure that. Dominique Tarasco, who first reported the possible kidnapping to the police, understands that his reluctance to reveal Guillaume Mingo's name hindered the timely rescue of Elodie. He acknowledges that he still regrets not fully cooperating with the police. Dominique believes he could have saved Elodie Morel because he knew enough but didn't act on it. He has never been charged in connection with this case.
Brent Poole took his wife's hand and surveyed the stretch of sandy beach between the Atlantic Ocean and vast dunes. They strolled slowly past private beach houses, and as they were engulfed by the darkness of the last untouched miles of forest running alongside the shore, the young man once again marveled at how romantic Myrtle Beach was. Situated between South Carolina and North Carolina, it was at the heart of the popular Grand Strand Beach. Like many tourists before him, Brent was enchanted by the rhythmic movement of the waves crashing onto the white sandy beach. Hand in hand with his beloved wife, he felt warm and joyful in his heart. Chuckling like a boy, Brent suggested to Renee, "Let's do it right here." The girl smiled and began to undress. A light breeze blowing in from the ocean cooled their naked bodies as the young couple enjoyed each other's company. After a while, Brent helped Renee get dressed, and he checked his watch. It was nearly midnight. They needed to head back to the hotel. Walking back hand in hand, they made plans for the future. In the distance, they noticed a large man dressed in black, his body covered tightly. But it wasn't just his appearance that frightened them. It was the fact that the man, who was initially heading in a different direction, suddenly turned and started following them. They picked up their pace, but they couldn't shake him off. The man ran ahead and leapt in front of them. He wore a ski mask, and in his hands was a gun that he pointed at the young couple. The weapon was black and looked almost like a plastic toy. The man ordered them to lie down on the ground. This guy is crazy, Renee thought. Brent remembered that he had an army Swiss knife in his pocket, which he bought at a flea market for Christmas. But what could he do with a knife against a gun? The stranger demanded that they hand over all their valuables. After taking their jewelry and money, the robber aimed the gun at Brent. He pulled the trigger once, twice, 3 times, but the gun refused to fire. While the robber confidently reloaded the weapon, a terrified Renee hoped that it was all just a tasteless joke and that he would leave soon. Then the man aimed the gun at Brent again. Brent begged him to spare his life. The robber smirked, glanced at Renee, and asked why he should spare him. "Because I have a daughter whom I love very much," Brent replied firmly. The shooter's eyes narrowed. He put the gun under Brent's chin and made him kneel. He pulled the trigger for the 4th time. Only this time, there was no misfire. Brent probably didn't hear the shot or feel it. But the shooter seemed unsatisfied and fired again. He wanted to make sure Brent was dead, although there was no need. The stranger turned and walked toward Renee, who lay on the sand, trembling with fear. She thought she would be the next one, but the stranger simply turned abruptly and ran toward the dunes. Renee got on her knees and called her husband's name softly through her tears. Just 10 minutes ago, they were celebrating their 3rd wedding anniversary, making plans for the future, joyfully discussing their little daughter Katie's first trip to the ocean. Renee sat by Brent, frightened and shocked. It's unclear how long she stayed in that state, but finally, she realized she needed to call for help. She remembered seeing a patrol car in the distance with her husband. With difficulty, she staggered in that direction. On June 9, 1998, shortly before midnight, Myrtle Beach patrolman Scott Brown was cruising along the deserted coastline of the Grand Strand when the headlights of his SUV suddenly caught sight of a girl frantically waving at him in the darkness. She was in a state of hysteria, and it's not surprising given what she told the patrolman. It was far beyond anything Scott was used to dealing with, like stolen wallets. But a stolen wallet was just the beginning of Renee's story. The masked stranger dressed in black had robbed them, and then he shot her husband twice in the head. The girl recounted how they obediently did everything the stranger told them, but it didn't save them. Scott, who had recently become a patrolman, was stunned upon hearing what had happened. Nonetheless, he quickly got his bearings and called for backup. On the crime scene, the arriving police officers found casings indicating that the perpetrator had used an automatic or semi-automatic weapon, which he took with him. This meant that the criminal was armed and possibly looking for another victim in the popular tourist area of the Grand Strand. The city's police, heavily reliant on tourism, could not afford another murder. They dedicated all their resources to finding the robber. The search led K9 units up to the road, but if the killer had a car, no one had seen it. Meanwhile, the police took Renee to the station, where they checked her hands for gunpowder residue. As a precautionary measure, they didn't find any. The police had no reason to suspect her, but the entire scenario of what had happened was troubling. A random beach robbery was unusual in itself, but a robbery and murder on the beach was almost unheard of. The strangest part of Renee's story, from the police's perspective, was that she survived to tell it. If the robber decided to shoot his victim in the head to eliminate a potential witness, then why leave Renee alive? She wasn't even tied up, and she was not struck or gagged. Renee recounted that the gun clicked, as if there were no more bullets left. The casings found on the beach seemed to confirm her words. According to her account, it appeared that it was her lucky day. Meanwhile, the police had the difficult task of informing the parents of the 24-year-old young man that their son had been killed. Interestingly, the first thing the parents asked was whether his wife was with him. And then they revealed to the police the unusual dynamics of the marital couple. Growing up in the suburbs of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Renee always had a way with guys. She caught Brent Bullseye in a serendipitous encounter in 1991 when they met in the school parking lot. A friend of Brent asked him to give Renee a ride home, and during that ride, Brent invited her on a date. Their whirlwind romance led to the news that they would become parents in March 1995, just 3 months after Renee turned 17. Brent proposed to Renee, traditionally getting down on one knee. Both of their families were unsure if they would be able to handle the responsibilities of parenthood. Fortunately, at 21 years old, Brent already had a promising career as a mechanic, working double shifts and making a decent income for a young man. Brent and Renee even managed to buy a small house in a residential area near Winston-Salem. At first glance, it seemed like things were going well for the young couple, but after the birth of their daughter in 1996, financial problems began to arise. To overcome their financial struggles, at Brent's suggestion, Renee took up a job as an exotic dancer at a local club in the spring of the following year. Brent was proud of his wife's job, and Renee enjoyed her new lifestyle. Her new job promised to help the family forget about their financial woes, with earnings ranging from $200 to $400 per night. However, Renee brought more than just cash home from the club. She became involved with some of her female co-workers, and according to rumors circulating in the club, Brent was supportive of these relationships. It seemed that he was open to experimenting in their marriage. But one of Renee's affairs turned out to be more serious than she had anticipated. In the spring of 1998, Renee began dating John Boyd Frazier, a computer systems technician and a DJ from the club. John was a pleasant young man, known for being generous with the ladies. Rumors suggested that this aspect of him was what attracted Renee to him. As Brent spent more time with his friends and, in Renee's opinion, didn't help her enough with their child, she decided to pack her bags, take their 2-year-old daughter, and move in with John. However, just a few days after the move, Renee met with a lawyer who explained to her that given her occupation as an exotic dancer and her relatively liberal views on relationships, she was unlikely to secure full custody of her daughter. This made Renee reconsider her decision to leave her husband. Renee packed her things and returned home to her husband. Brent, who was willing to do anything to keep Renee, welcomed her back with open arms. To celebrate their reconciliation, the whole family went on vacation to Myrtle Beach. The family vacation started off wonderfully, with them all enjoying a few days basking in the sun on the beach. However, On the evening of June 9th, on the 3rd anniversary of their wedding, Renee and Brent decided to spend the evening just the two of them. Renee had arranged for a babysitter for their daughter, Katie, at the hotel, but when the sitter arrived, their plans were almost derailed as Katie started crying. Brent tried to comfort their daughter, but Renee practically pushed him out of the hotel room. The couple visited 2 night spots, had dinner, and had a few cocktails. Then, a little after 11 o'clock, they decided to take advantage of the many secluded spots near their hotel. What happened next was known to the police. Upon learning the name of Renee's lover, the Myrtle Beach police called Salem to request an immediate visit to John's house and verify if he was there. They also spoke with Renee again. She confirmed the statements made by Brent's parents. Renee admitted that she had been involved with other men, including her affair with John, but claimed that all those affairs were in the past. However, she was uncertain if John agreed with her on this. Under pressure from the detectives, Renee admitted that she wasn't sure. By 5 a.m. on June 10th, Brent had been dead for 5 hours, and the Myrtle Beach police had a suspect in the murder, John Frazier. Detectives found out that he had called in sick to work on that day when he was supposed to be working. Unfortunately for the investigators, when they knocked on John's door, he was at home. It was almost impossible for him to travel to Myrtle Beach, commit the crime, return, change clothes, and then open the door for the police. The police had no choice but to apologize, wish him a good night, and leave. The police took up the investigation again with Renee. She came to the station accompanied by a lawyer, not a criminal defense attorney, but one who had helped her sister in her divorce. Renee repeated her story when suddenly her lawyer interrupted the conversation. He asked to speak with his client alone, but just when the investigators thought the conversation was over, they faced an unexpected surprise. Upon returning to the interrogation room, the lawyer instructed Renee to tell everything she knew, and Renee confessed that John was the one who pulled the trigger that night. She recognized him by his voice and mannerisms. Justifying herself, she claimed that she had to convince herself first that it was him. Now the police had to find out how John ended up on a secluded beach in another city on June 9th. Fortunately, a witness appeared at the right time. Bruce Wolford, a bartender at the club where Renee worked and John's friend, heard Renee talking to John about her plans to go to Myrtle Beach with her husband for their wedding anniversary. He also mentioned seeing John attempting to fight Brent on one occasion. In John's daily planner, the police found a note under June 9th that said Renee and Brent, although it was later discovered that he simply marked all the important dates of his friends and acquaintances. John was immediately arrested, but unlike Renee, he didn't give away a single word. The investigators believed that they would get the whole story from Renee. She made a mistake when she recanted her initial testimony. She was arrested right next to the funeral home and taken in for questioning. The detective did everything possible to extract information from Renee, even if it meant deceiving her. Although John Frazier refused to speak, the detective falsely told Renee that John had confessed to killing her husband at her request. They threatened her, saying that she would never see her daughter again unless she accused John of the crime and revealed where he had hidden the weapon. Gradually, after a 2-hour interrogation, Renee's story began to change. She confessed that she knew about John's threats to kill Brent but didn't take her lover's words seriously. The next day, Renee was accused of murder, and the prosecutor decided to insist on the harshest punishment for her. Her defense attorney, who specializes in criminal cases, demanded that she withdraw her confession. The case against Renee was essentially based on the fact that John was the shooter. However, the prosecutors faced serious difficulties. Apart from Renee's confession, they had no other evidence. To prove that Renee lured her husband out of the hotel room to set up John as the shooter, they needed a witness who could link her lover to the crime scene, and they found 2 witnesses right away. 2 elderly individuals were also staying at the same hotel as the couple and coincidentally celebrating their wedding anniversary there. On the day after the murder, They contacted the police to report that they had been on the beach the previous evening and saw a man dressed in black who frightened them. They identified John from a photograph, claiming that he appeared suspicious and they remembered his face. Although this statement immediately raised many doubts because it was nighttime and the beach had limited lighting, making it unlikely for them to clearly see a man at a considerable distance. Nevertheless, the prosecutors attempted to convict Renee, hoping that her accomplice would then admit guilt. Renee's guilt hinged on what she knew about John's plan. However, if John was not the murderer, then she had no connection to the crime at all. Detectives managed to pressure the shocked girl into confessing, which became the primary evidence against her in the case. Renee lost 15 pounds during this ordeal. They desperately needed a confession to prevent tourists from fearing to visit the city. It was crucial for them to portray Brent's death as something other than a random robbery. Renee's defense attorney believes that she was convicted for her lifestyle. However, the prosecutors argued that her lifestyle had a more significant impact on Brent. Being unfaithful to her husband and working in such a profession made divorce not an option for her. It seemed more logical to get rid of Brent. Her reunion with her husband was just one step in her fatal betrayal because being with her boyfriend during her husband's murder did not play in her favor. The jury deliberated for a long time and finally found the prosecution's arguments more compelling. Kimberly Renee Poole was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The trial of John, who had no intention of admitting guilt, took place shortly after that. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison despite the lack of actual evidence against him. The prosecutors didn't even call Bruce Wolford to testify. If Bruce had been a reliable witness, the prosecutors would have been eager to put him on the stand and convince the jury that John was the only person with a motive to remove Brent Poole from the picture. The problem was that there were several people who liked Renee and saw her husband as an obstacle, and Bruce Wolford was at the top of that list. Darrell Wilson, a private detective hired by John Fraser's mother, thoroughly investigated the case and came to the conclusion that Bruce was just as likely a suspect as John. The former police officer spoke not only with Bruce but also with many other witnesses involved in the case. In particular, he found Chris Hensley, another witness completely ignored by the police, who had a much better view and recollection of what happened on the beach that night. Firstly, he deduced what Renee and Brent were doing on the beach after seeing Brent's unbuttoned shirt. Secondly, he encountered a man dressed in black who passed very close to him, and Chris even greeted him out of politeness. According to Chris, the composite sketch based on his description didn't resemble John at all. However, when the private detective showed Chris a computer-generated composite and pictures of Bruce, Chris stated that the man in the photo matched the composite sketch very closely based on what he remembered about the person's height, hair, and face. Even more incriminating was the fact that Bruce had installed spyware on Renee's home computer, giving him complete control over her computer. This allowed him to monitor Renee's activities for 6 months, knowing everything about her whereabouts and plans, and reading all her emails and messages. Bruce became even more suspicious given that he owned a semi-automatic pistol and had access to a white van with a number sticker on the window, similar to the one witnesses saw on the beach before the murder. By killing Brent and framing John for the crime, Bruce could eliminate 2 rivals at once. After the trial, a campaign for the review of Renee's case began. Her new attorney filed an appeal on the grounds that her predecessor had performed poorly in her duties. The court-appointed public defender only met with Renee once before the trial, and that was just to push her to agree to a 30-year sentence in exchange for confessing to conspiracy to commit murder. The prosecutors implanted in the minds of the jury the idea that there was no robbery at all because approximately a month after the murder, Brent's wallet was found in the yard of a nearby house with $9 in cash, Brent's driver's license, and a bank card he used to pay for dinner at a restaurant. However, the defense attorney could easily prove that $50 were missing from Brent's wallet, which he had withdrawn from an ATM on the night of the murder to pay the babysitter. Moreover, the babysitter's testimony about Renee's alleged haste was misinterpreted. The babysitter could only sit with the child from 9 p.m. to 12 a.m., and she got lost, took some time to find the right hotel and was 15 minutes late. Therefore, Renee was in a hurry to go for a walk with her husband just to spend more time with him within the 3-hour time frame allocated for babysitting. These are not all the facts that were not presented by the defense at the trial. In particular, there were electronic emails confirming that it was Brent who suggested going to Myrtle Beach. So, it wasn't Renee who lured her husband to a secluded beach. It was Brent who wanted to add some excitement to their intimate life, which is why they bought a beach towel on the way back from the restaurant at 10:52 p.m. Since they were supposed to go back home the next day, it was their last evening when Brent's desire could be fulfilled. Everything happened spontaneously. If it was premeditated, Renee would have taken a small towel with her to ensure nothing hindered the execution of her plan. Moreover, if the murder was planned, it would have been more logical for Renee to keep her husband in a secluded, wooded area until her accomplice arrived. However, the crime occurred as they were returning to the hotel. When they noticed a stranger following them, they hurried their pace. Brent even had time to draw his knife and potentially alter the situation in his favor. The Brent family has initiated an investigation along this path, claiming that Renee is responsible for everything. They have turned against her, blaming her for the moral choices their son made and desired. Renee's attorney should emphasize that Brent himself wanted her to work as a stripper and engage in relationships with other people, undermining the prosecution's theory. As Renee continues to fight for what is called mitigation of punishment after the verdict, she serves her sentence in prison. Brent's parents have been granted custody of Katie, although Renee managed to build a healthy and loving relationship with her daughter. In prison, Renee creates Braille textbooks for blind children, and her colleagues and supervisors highly value her work. To this day, she maintains her claim of innocence and insists that she does not know who robbed them with Brent and shot her husband.
At 9 a.m. on Monday, October 31st, 2002, the owner of the trading company, Steve Canavan, opened the door of the warehouse located in the small town of Huyton, near Liverpool, United Kingdom, intending to start the work week. However, upon entering the warehouse, he immediately noticed bloody shoe prints. Following the tracks into a utility room, he discovered the body of a man on the floor.
Steve realized there was nothing he could do to help. Blood was everywhere, and the deceased's face was disfigured beyond recognition. Officers called by Steve noticed a large gunshot hole in the warehouse ceiling. Comparing this with the appearance of the deceased and the mark on the back of his head, they concluded that he had been shot in the face with a shotgun. The head injury was so severe that identification was impossible. However, documents in the victim's pockets revealed the name Gerald or Jed Gilbert. Company owner Steve Canavan explained that 46-year-old Jed worked for him as a sales manager. He was his best employee, a talented salesman who would be irreplaceable. Jed's abilities allowed him to earn well and buy a wonderful Victorian-style house. Success, however, did not go to his head. He was a very pleasant, kind, and of course, sociable person, which was natural for such a job. Steve had no idea why someone would shoot Jed. However, there was a safe on the premises, embedded in the floor. The mat covering the safe was shifted, but it did not seem like someone was looking for keys or attempting to break in. Did Jed come to work during a robbery? An inventory of all items in the warehouse was needed to ensure nothing was missing. However, a more careful examination of the crime scene suggested another scenario. There were no signs of a break-in or forced entry into the warehouse. And when the forensic expert moved the body, 2 bloodied latex fragments were found underneath, likely from a glove. It seemed the killer was trying to create the appearance of a robbery to hide the fact that he came here with the sole purpose of killing Jed Gilbert. Jed arrived at work where the perpetrator lay in wait. When the man opened the door, the killer entered behind him. But why would someone want to kill an ordinary sales manager? Detectives decided to ask this question to his ex-wife, who had just arrived at the crime scene. Jed Gilbert and Ann Huxley met at a nightclub when he was 41 and she was 32. At first glance, they had nothing in common. Ann was born and raised in Kensington, not a very prestigious area of Liverpool where working-class people reside. She had been divorced twice and was raising a daughter and a son. Jed, on the other hand, lived a lavish lifestyle and had never been tied down by marriage. However, they shared an entrepreneurial spirit. both willing to work hard to secure a better life for themselves. Anne managed a network of small businesses, including coffee shops popular among the police, who enjoyed stopping by for a cup of coffee. Anne and Jed immediately liked each other and started dating. The man's family, his sister and mother, didn't approve of the girl, but the lovers paid no attention to it. A year later, Anne moved in with Jed, and in 1998 they got married. Unfortunately, in 2002, after just 4 years of marriage, they divorced. But they continued to live in the same house, under the same roof, just in different rooms. Apparently, their feelings had not cooled, and after some time, the former spouses reconciled and even wanted to remarry. But the day before, on Sunday, the man urgently left for work because he needed to resolve an issue with urgent delivery or something similar and did not return home. After Anne called all relatives, friends, and neighbors all night, she came to his workplace in the morning. Anne went into hysterics upon hearing that Jed had been killed. When she calmed down a bit, the detectives asked if she knew the reason someone might want to harm Jed. They were sure she would say no, but to their surprise, Anne answered yes. Jed was into gambling, a regular at the casino, but unfortunately he was not a very lucky player. He had accumulated debts, and Anne feared that it would end with them losing their home. That's why, she claimed, she divorced him so that he couldn't dispose of it on his own. However, her husband still found a way to get the money. He embezzled £11,000 from the company he worked for. This meant that the police needed to have a more serious conversation with his boss, Steve Canavan. But that wasn't all. Anne revealed that after the divorce, she was seeing a man named Paul Gunning. Her new boyfriend didn't like that she and her ex-husband were still living under the same roof. Eventually, Anne got fed up, broke up with the man, but he wouldn't let go. In the end, she had to take extreme measures. She asked a friend to intimidate Paul Gunning to make him leave her alone. Thanks to Anne, the investigation gained a whole new set of leads. Perhaps Jed owed a significant amount of money to dangerous people, or was there a conflict with the employer due to embezzlement from the company? Finally, could it be a jealous lover deciding to eliminate a rival? While the police were exploring the most likely scenarios, the autopsy report arrived. The forensic expert determined the cause of Jed Gilbert's death, and it turned out to be completely different from what the detectives had expected. Although someone had clearly fired into the ceiling, there were no signs that the man had been shot. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, and the brutality and force of the beating were simply unimaginable. Every bone in the victim's skull was broken, and there was a hole above the left eyebrow. The blows were clearly not inflicted with the butt of a shotgun, and when the police completed an inventory of what was in the warehouse, they found that only a fire extinguisher was missing. So the killer beat the man with a fire extinguisher and took him away from the crime scene. But who could display such cruelty? Jed's ex-wife believed that due to his gambling addiction, he had earned many dangerous enemies. The police investigated the casinos he frequented but couldn't find any significant leads. They failed to establish a connection with casino owners or debt collectors. Moreover, wouldn't Jed be more valuable alive if they wanted him to repay his debts? On the other hand, there was the man's boss, Steve Canavan, from whom Jed had stolen £11,000. However, the police faced another setback here. Steve denied that he would kill an employee over £11,000, especially an employee who brought him much larger profits. Steve even admitted that Jed was irreplaceable. Therefore, he simply demanded the stolen amount back and deducted the money from his salary. At the time of the murder, Jed had returned £5,000. Finally, Steve had a confirmed alibi, and detectives had to acknowledge that nothing pointed to the man's involvement. There was one more potential suspect mentioned by Anne Huxley, her ex-boyfriend, Paul Gunning. Anne thought it was possible that Paul Gunning might have wanted to get rid of Jed to take his place. However, during the conversation with the detectives, Paul vehemently denied any involvement in the case. He spoke openly and directly to the police. Yes, he had a romance with Anne, but it remained in the past, and he had no grievances against her ex-husband. He also had a solid alibi for the time of Jed Gilbert's death. While detectives couldn't find anything linking Paul Gunning to Jed's murder, the man provided them with a very unexpected piece of information. He used to own an escort agency, and a few years ago, Anne Huxley came to work for him. Apparently, she was not devoid of entrepreneurial spirit, as she quickly not only bought the agency from him, but also opened 4 more. The network of stores and coffee shops. including the one frequented by police officers, was just a successful cover for Anne's expanding business, and it was far from the business she claimed to be involved in when talking to the police. It's not entirely clear what prompted the detectives to also speak with Anne's friend, whom she asked to intimidate Paul Gunning. However, after talking to him, they encountered a big surprise. The man, also named Paul Eaton, worked as a bouncer in a nightclub in Birkenhead near Liverpool, where Anne was looking for a place for her next escort agency. They met and became friends there. But according to the 40-year-old man, they were not just friends. Anne was his fiancée. The man admitted that he was in love with Anne, and during a trip to South Africa, he proposed to her, and they got engaged. In other words, it might not have been Paul Gunning, but Paul Eaton who could be jealous of Anne's ex-husband, with whom she lived under the same roof. However, the man replied that he had no reason to be jealous because Anne accepted his proposal, as if that explained everything. Detectives asked him about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, and that's when Paul Eaton started talking nonsense. He claimed that his mother fell ill. He became upset, and seeking support, he called a friend, another Paul Lewis. They got into a car to go to Wales, but on the way, the car started making strange noises, and they had to turn back. They went to a bar, had some drinks, and when they left the bar, the car wouldn't start at all. Investigators verified the alibi with his friend, 36-year-old Paul Lewis, also a bouncer at the bar, who confirmed his friend's words. Although there was nothing particularly fantastic in this version of events, investigators did not believe it. And what also bothered them was that if Anne could easily lie to the police about her fiancé, what else was she willing to lie about? In other words, she immediately classified her ex-boyfriend as a potential suspect, but strangely forgot to mention the man she was planning to marry. Furthermore, according to Anne, she and her husband had reconciled and were planning to remarry, and she referred to Paul Eaton as a friend who had done her a favor. So what was really going on? After examining every detail of Anne's testimony, investigators confirmed that on that fateful day, she spent time with her family, making several calls to Jed's relatives and friends, expressing concern for him. She even called her fiancé, precisely at the time when, according to his account, they were heading to Wales with a friend. However, the ping from his phone showed that he was actually in the vicinity of the crime scene. Suspicions about Paul Eaton's involvement grew, but what role did his fiancé play in all of this? According to Anne, in early 2002, her husband's gaming addiction forced her to divorce him to avoid losing their house, but they tried to mend their relationship. However, when investigators spoke to the man's relatives, they painted a completely different picture. The man's addiction didn't scare Anne. It infuriated her, so there was no talk of reconciliation. She filed for divorce because she was disgusted by her husband and she had had enough of him. Anne didn't leave the house because he paid for the roof over her head, but treated him like a doormat. After the divorce, they slept in separate rooms, and Anne occasionally brought other men home. This seemingly tormenting situation for Jed lasted for months until everything suddenly changed. One of Jed's friends told the police that in the summer of 2002, he had dinner with the former spouses and couldn't believe the positive changes in their relationship. They appeared to be a happy couple again. Anne affectionately embraced Jed and assured everyone that they were planning to remarry. Completely perplexed, investigators couldn't understand why Paul Eaton believed they were engaged when Anne was planning to marry her ex-husband again. Everything fell into place after examining the finances of the former spouses. One August day, Anne walked into an insurance office and took out a £400,000 life insurance policy on both of them. In the event of the sudden death of one of the ex-spouses, the surviving one would receive £400,000. She then went to a lawyer with a will in which Jed left everything to her. 6 weeks later, he was killed. Anne Huxley increasingly appeared as a black widow who lured her ex-husband into a deadly trap to collect the insurance payout in the house. Meanwhile, evidence against Paul Eaton and Paul Lewis was accumulating like a snowball. The owner of the nightclub in Birkenhead, where both men worked as bouncers, revealed that on the night Jed was killed, the men came to the club carrying a fire extinguisher. Perhaps they thought no one would pay attention to two bouncers with a fire extinguisher. The adjacent building to the club belonged to a hot-dip galvanizing workshop, which housed acid containers. The police contacted the workshop and requested the containers to be drained. There, they found the fire extinguisher. It was damaged but not destroyed. Immediately after this, The results came in from examining the latex scraps found under Jed's body. They were indeed pieces of a glove with Paul Lewis's DNA. It was minimal, but enough to prove that Paul Lewis was at the crime scene, wearing gloves, and must have been involved in the murder. So, after 2 months of investigation, the police had gathered enough evidence against Paul Eaton and Paul Lewis. However, detectives were convinced that Anne also played a role in her ex-husband's murder. She had already persuaded Paul Eaton to attack her boyfriend. What would stop her from orchestrating another assault, only this time to get rid of her husband and claim his property and insurance? The challenge remained in proving it because all the evidence collected so far was circumstantial. On December 16, 2002, 6 weeks after Jed's murder, Paul Eaton and Paul Lewis were arrested and brought in for questioning. Paul Eaton didn't resist for long and admitted that he was at the warehouse, but claimed he went there supposedly to warn Jed to stay away from his fiancée. However, Jed reacted aggressively, suddenly pulled out a shotgun and pointed it at Paul. With no other option, Paul had to defend himself. The men struggled. A shot was fired and the bullet hit the ceiling. Then, Paul Eaton reached for the fire extinguisher hanging on the wall and struck his opponent with it. After the commotion, his friend rushed in. Paul Lewis confirmed that he was waiting in the car outside when he heard a loud noise and ran inside. There, he saw the victim on the floor, and Paul Eaton beating him with the fire extinguisher. It was not entirely self-defense, since Paul Eaton came to the warehouse on his own, but he presented the situation as if it was a quarrel and claimed no guilt in the murder. However, this story did not explain why Paul Lewis ran to the warehouse in latex gloves and how they ended up torn under the victim's body. Both men also remained silent about Anne. Therefore, when she appeared at the police station the next day, she confidently told the same story as before. She claimed to be mourning her husband, and there was no reason to suspect her of the murder. Supposedly, Paul Eaton was so infatuated with her that he decided to commit murder, and she knew nothing about it. As for the insurance and the will, these documents were arranged in the interests of her children. If anything were to happen to her, they would be financially protected. The police had nothing to counter her argument. Fortunately, as it often happens, the killer cannot keep their crime a secret. A witness, to whom Paul Eaton confessed everything, came forward to the police. In reality, he entered the warehouse with a shotgun, intending to shoot Jed. However, at the last minute, he couldn't bring himself to commit the crime. Paul Eaton was a strong man, a bouncer at the club, but not a criminal, and he lacked the courage to kill someone face to face. Jed seized the weapon, and a struggle ensued. It's unclear how it would have ended, but Paul Lewis came to his friend's aid. He grabbed a fire extinguisher and began beating Jed. At some point, Paul Eaton might have taken control, although detectives believe that Paul Lewis was responsible for all the fatal blows to Jed. Leaving the lifeless man on the floor, the accomplices left. The witness stated that the accomplices did it for money, and promised the men £100,000 collectively for committing the crime. The witness's testimony not only provided the police with enough evidence to charge Paul Eaton and Paul Lewis, but also confirmed the police's suspicions that the mastermind behind it all was the Black Widow, Anne Haxley. As if that wasn't enough, another witness came forward, providing testimony against the accomplices. On that fateful evening, he agreed to give his friends a ride to the warehouse, thinking they needed to repossess a car due to unpaid debts. There was a van near the warehouse, and the witness assumed that the men would take it. This didn't surprise him at all, as they had previously performed similar tasks for insurance companies. According to his account, Paul Eaton and Paul Lewis asked him to park nearby and simply wait for a call. Interestingly, he parked right next to a mobile phone tower. After 20 minutes, they called and asked to pick them up. Only when they got into the car did the man realize that he had allowed himself to get involved in something unpleasant. The men were discussing an attack on someone, and he noticed blood on one of their shoes. There was enough evidence and witness testimony to charge both men with the murder of Jed and Anne with conspiracy to commit murder. The only thing the police didn't find was the shotgun the men disposed of. The trials began in April 2004. Since Paul Eaton was accused of delivering the fatal blows, he appeared before the judge first. Surprisingly, he shocked everyone by confessing to the murder. In England and Wales, this automatically leads to a life sentence. His decision sparked many debates and speculations. Some believed he got in too deep and would have been convicted anyway. Others thought he couldn't bear Anne's suffering and was trying to protect her. Unfortunately, she didn't reciprocate when it was her turn to testify.
She happily confirmed that Paul Eaton took matters into his own hands out of jealousy because she and Jed had reconciled. Anne tried to portray herself as a modest housewife, but her efforts were unsuccessful. The prosecution effectively portrayed Anne as a black widow. Angry over her husband's gambling debts, she divorced him only to devise a deadly plan to enrich herself at his expense. She was willing to stop at nothing to get the house and £400,000. When Paul Lewis gave his testimony, he also tried to shift the blame onto Paul Eaton, despite the evidence suggesting otherwise. In the end, all three were found guilty. The men were sentenced to life imprisonment, and Anne received a 20-year prison term. The men were given the opportunity to apply for parole in 2020, but their release was denied. From the very beginning, the murder of Jed Gilbert, a 46-year-old sales manager, resembled the script of a Hollywood movie more than an ordinary criminal case. Relentlessly following the trail of evidence, detectives ventured into the realm of gambling, love triangles, escort agencies, and finally apprehended murderers driven by the desire for quick gain. Passion, greed, jealousy, betrayal, the list could go on indefinitely. This case had it all. Several years before the John Benet Ramsey case, America was trying to solve the mystery of the disappearance of 7-year-old Jacqueline Dovalibi. Was she abducted by a stranger who entered her home under the cover of night? Or did she become a victim within her own family? The police were convinced that the culprits were always in plain sight, whereas no one who knew the family doubted their complete innocence. Midlothian, located in the state of Illinois, USA, is a small town where everyone knows each other. It is situated approximately 30 minutes south of the bustling streets of Chicago and is considered a quiet suburb where there is always a sense of being in a familiar place. However, in 1988, the town changed forever when 7-year-old Jacqueline Dovalibi disappeared from her own bedroom in the middle of the night. Jacqueline lived in a cozy ranch-style home with her parents, David and Cynthia, and her 4-year-old brother, Davy. The family resided in a beautiful location surrounded by several nature preserves, all within walking distance from their home. Jacqueline's biological father, Jimmy Guess, had no involvement in her life after a bitter divorce from Cynthia shortly after their daughter was born. David Dovalibi adopted Jacqueline when he married Cynthia 5 years ago when Jacqueline was 2 years old, and he was the only father she knew. Cynthia worked as a dietitian at the local hospital, and David was a carpenter who had been promoted to a foreman. David and Jacqueline had an instant connection, often going fishing and bowling together. According to one neighbor whose daughter was friends with Jacqueline, she was a happy little girl who never showed any signs of sadness or anger. According to all accounts, the Dovalibis were a typical, close-knit suburban family. On the evening of September 10, 1988, Cynthia took Jacqueline and Davy to a nearby KFC Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant, while David met up with his friends and went bowling. When all family members returned home, they watched television, and Jacqueline, wearing her favorite purple and white pajamas, kissed Cynthia and David goodnight. What exactly happened in the house that night remains unclear, but the next morning, the little brunette with brown eyes was no longer there. David and his son woke up earlier than the other family members on the next morning, and around 7:45, David noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. At first, he thought that his mother, who lived with the family, had left it open and didn't worry much about it. He prepared breakfast for Davy and turned on the television. A little later, Cynthia woke up and went to wake up their daughter but couldn't find Jacqueline in her bedroom. The parents called Jacqueline's friends, thinking that she might have gone outside to play. While they searched for the child inside the house and in the neighborhood, Cynthia noticed that the basement window was broken and wide open. David immediately called the police and reported his daughter's disappearance. After investigators arrived at the house, Cynthia and David explained that none of them had heard anything unusual during the night, and they had all been sound asleep. Nothing was missing from the house except Jacqueline's blanket, which matched the colors of her pajamas. Furthermore, there were no signs of a struggle. Investigators needed to determine whether someone had broken into the house and taken Jacqueline, or if she had left the house herself, only to be taken by someone else. Although there were no phone calls or ransom notes, the FBI agents took over the investigation, presuming that they were dealing with a kidnapping rather than a runaway case. Soon, the news of a possible abduction spread throughout the town. The suburb mainly consisted of families with young children, and the possibility that someone had broken into a family's home and abducted their little girl in the middle of the night while everyone was asleep was a horrifying revelation. Considering that there were no signs of a struggle,
investigators began to wonder if the girl might have left with someone she knew. If the intruder had entered the house through the broken basement window, they needed to be familiar with the layout of the house to enter the girl's room without waking the other family members, investigators concluded. We are looking at it with an open mind as a potential abduction, but also as an abduction with someone known to the family, said Police Captain John Bitton. This statement led Cynthia to recall an unsettling incident that occurred several years earlier. After a bitter custody battle during which her former partner, Jimmy Guest, did everything in his power to keep their daughter with him, he had broken into their home and attempted to take their daughter. Therefore, Cynthia suspected his involvement in Jacqueline's disappearance because she knew he was capable of such actions. Jacqueline's grandmother, Anne Dovalibi, admits that she wasn't initially worried about her granddaughter's safety because she believed that Jacqueline had been taken by her biological father, and she was confident they would quickly get her back. However, she couldn't have known that Jimmy had been in prison in Florida for the previous 4 months during Jacqueline's disappearance and was soon ruled out as a suspect. Suspicion also fell on Jacqueline's uncle, Timothy Guest, who lived nearby and suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. However, he had an alibi. It was at this point that Cynthia began to worry that something bad had happened to her daughter. The parents of the girl, Cynthia and David, were questioned multiple times in the following days. They didn't hide anything. They explained that Jacqueline had gone to bed at 10 p.m., and when Cynthia went to check on her at 11 p.m., she was sound asleep. The police became increasingly skeptical of the parents' story. It was difficult for them to believe that a person unfamiliar with the layout of the house could have crawled through the basement window without disturbing the towel dryer right beneath the window. Then, they would have had to walk down the hallway to the girl's room and take her away without waking any of the other family members. The only sign that a stranger had been in the house was the broken window. No fingerprints or signs of a struggle were found. Indeed, when it comes to fingerprints and other evidence, it's important to note that the police themselves made a series of mistakes that could have influenced their conclusions. They never secured the girl's room to prevent anyone from entering it, and they didn't thoroughly search the house. A forensic expert took photographs, but he didn't even bother to take close-up pictures of the broken window. He checked the window and the front door for fingerprints, but not the back door. What was even more astonishing was that the police allowed friends of the family to clean up their house and even sweep away the glass from the broken window. The police just stood by and watched as they cleaned up, destroying any evidence that the kidnapper might have left behind. Immediately after the girl's disappearance, Jacqueline's parents were asked to take a polygraph test. Cynthia was too distraught for such a test. Friends recall that she was in a terrible state, constantly feeling nauseous. David underwent the polygraph test, which he passed. But in the minds of the police, everything seemed to point to the parents. The number of potential suspects sharply narrowed after one of the forensic experts stated that, in his opinion, the basement window had been broken from the inside. On September 14th, 5 days after the girl's disappearance, the parents attempted to take a polygraph test again. Cynthia's results were inconclusive due to her emotional state. David's results were also inconclusive, and the polygraph examiner accused him of not cooperating with the investigation. David in turn claimed that the polygraph examiner instructed him to answer yes to all questions, including the question, "Did you kill your daughter?" to which David refused to answer yes. Afterward, David was taken into an interrogation room and was not released for 5 hours. Later that evening, Michael Chapman pulled into the parking lot of the Islander Apartments on 1912 Canal Street in Blue Island, a town located about 5 kilometers from the girl's home. When Chapman exited his car, he noticed an unpleasant odor in the fresh autumn air. He spotted something wrapped up in the grass, which he described as a wrapped-up object. As he approached, he saw a head and a hand, and he immediately ran inside to call the police. Jacqueline's body was discovered, and she was still bound with a 2-meter rope, which was considered evidence of the crime. Her soiled underwear was found about 60 centimeters from her body. As for the police, they continued to question Jacqueline's father for about 1.5 hours without informing him that his daughter had been found. They tried to convince him to confess to the crime. When Officer Kevin Shaughnessy finally told him about Jacqueline's discovery, David didn't believe him, thinking it was another police trick to make him confess. This is likely why he responded with the phrase, "I guess you think I should cry now?" However, Officer Shaughnessy interpreted these words differently, and they convinced him not to pursue other suspects. In any case, there was no evidence against David, and he was released to go home, where he found his distraught wife and realized that his daughter was truly gone. By morning, with the help of dental records, the body was officially identified as Jacqueline DeWallaby. Initially, based solely on the appearance of the body, there was speculation that she had been struck on the head, but the Cook County coroner, Dr. Robert Stein, stated that the condition of the body was the result of rapid decomposition due to the unusually warm September weather. Dr. Stein could not determine with certainty whether the girl had been sexually assaulted or not due to the state of decomposition. Although the exact time of death couldn't be determined either, Robert Stein concluded that she had been dead for several days, and the terrible crime was most likely committed early Saturday morning, right after her disappearance. After the body was identified, and given that they had been individually questioned for hours before Jacqueline was found, both Cynthia and David hired lawyers who advised them to invoke their Fifth Amendment rights and not answer any more questions from investigators. They had already told the police everything they knew, provided blood and urine samples, and gave permission for investigators to examine any family medical records that might be relevant. They also allowed investigators access to their home for all 5 days that Jacqueline was missing. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution allows citizens to refuse to answer any questions that may incriminate them. The DeWallabys had every right to invoke the Fifth Amendment. However, with no other suspects, law enforcement focused their attention on Cynthia and David as the primary suspects and claimed that it was suspicious that they were not cooperating with investigators. Police rushed to accuse the family of refusing to cooperate with the investigation. Prosecutor Patrick O'Brien explained, "Even if you are being looked at as a suspect, and you know deep down inside that you didn't do this, and it's unfair, the idea of not cooperating with the police that are investigating the murder of your daughter seems overly concerned about your personal interests." On the day after the funeral, a team of 20 police officers executed search warrants at the DeWallaby home. They emerged from the house with several large bags containing items they wanted to examine in the laboratory. Additionally, they confiscated the family's blue Chevrolet Malibu. Months passed, but there were no updates or new information about the case. However, the police made a statement indicating that the family members had not been excluded as suspects. Cynthia's lawyer, Lawrence Hyman, criticized the police investigation, calling it a blatant violation of the law. While Cynthia and David continued to avoid communicating with the media, they had a multitude of supporters. Neighbors stood by the family, telling journalists that the DeWallabys were a loving and caring family, and they had never heard either of the parents raise their voice at Jacqueline or Davy. David's boss, Ross Patterson, recalled, "The only time David took a day off work was when he needed to get documents for Jacqueline's adoption. However, this did not convince the investigators. Adhering to the theory that Cynthia and David could be involved in the crime, they returned to the location where the body was found and began showing photos of Cynthia, David, and their car to residents of the Islander apartments, hoping to find any witnesses who might have seen them in the area. On November 22nd, Cynthia and David were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Their son Davy was placed under the care of the Department of Family and Children's Services. It became known that a tenant of the apartment complex where the body was found had told investigators that he had seen David in a blue Chevy Malibu in the parking lot. A witness, a 35-year-old city transportation worker named Everett Mann, said that around 2 a.m. on September 10th, he was pulling into the parking lot, and his headlights illuminated a blue Chevy with a driver he claimed was David DeWallaby. During Cynthia and David's arrest, they were deliberately paraded in front of the media so that as many photos as possible could be taken, seemingly to convey the message, "Look, we've done our job." Detectives boasted about having a wealth of evidence against David and Cynthia, including 2 witnesses. However, it remained unclear why loving parents would act this way towards their daughter. Were there enough pieces of evidence? Or were the investigators rushing to take the case to court for some reason? Perhaps the answer to this question lies in the fact that on the same day as the parents' arrest, a major news story emerged. Richard M. Daley, the state's chief prosecutor whose office was handling the case, announced his candidacy for mayor of Chicago. Critics accused him of using a high-profile crime in his political game, but despite the criticism, Daley became the mayor of Chicago, and the case was handed over to the court. It is widely known that eyewitness testimonies are highly unreliable. Nevertheless, the witness statements suggesting that David was near the crime scene were enough to charge him and his wife with first-degree murder. Blue Island Police Chief Paul Greaves referred to these witness testimonies as excellent evidence that allowed them to rule out other leads.
The police never disclosed what those other leads were, but relying solely on witness testimony to exclude all other possibilities seemed somewhat prejudicial, especially considering that Cynthia was not linked to the crime scene. Both spouses were denied bail, and it was revealed that Cynthia was in the early stages of pregnancy. In the search for new evidence, the police decided to focus on the couple's 5-year-old son, Davy, who was examined by a doctor. Supposedly, the doctor found traces on his body that could have resulted from a belt, some of which were old while others were recent. The police suspected that Cynthia and David had abused Davy at home, suggesting it could be a motive for the crime. Patrick Murphy, Davy's state-appointed guardian, said that the police and prosecutors continuously questioned the child for days. He added that after speaking with Davy and reviewing his medical records, he couldn't understand how they arrived at such a conclusion because he couldn't find anything that indicated violence against the child. He also mentioned that Davy constantly pleaded to see his parents, and he missed them greatly. In mid-December, Cynthia and David were released on bail, but Davy was not allowed to return home with his parents. He was placed in the custody of David's sister Rose and her husband John. Davy was only allowed to see his parents during supervised visits. In April 1990, the court proceedings began. It became clear early on that the evidence gathered by law enforcement was not as compelling as initially reported. The prosecutors didn't even have a clear motive for the crime, but fortunately for them, they were not legally obligated to provide one. Their main argument was straightforward. There were no outsiders in the house, so the Dovalibys must be guilty. The defense argued that due to the poor police work, it was impossible to determine how the intruder had entered the house and what had transpired inside during that night. The idea that the intruder needed to know the layout of the house to find Jacqueline's bedroom seemed far-fetched. The family lived in a typical ranch-style house. Many such houses are built with a similar layout. Anyone who had ever been inside a similar house would likely know the layout. The prosecutors also tried to argue that the intruder had to navigate through a window without disturbing objects below, such as a vanity, a TV stand, and a towel rack. To demonstrate that this was possible, David filmed a video showing how a neighbor climbed through the basement window, propped his leg on the wall, and didn't disturb any objects below. Furthermore, it turned out that the prosecution had only one witness, not two. Everett Mann, the key prosecution witness, admitted during the trial that he had identified David solely by his prominent nose. He was about 70 meters away from the man in the parking lot and only remembered his distinctive nose, as it was dark and the lighting was quite dim. Moreover, during the photo identification, Everett was shown a frontal picture of David, while he had only seen the person in profile. Additionally, David's photo was much larger than the 4 photos of other men. Everett admitted that the person he saw that night could have been African American or Caucasian, or even a man or a woman, and all he saw was a silhouette that only looked male. In a night without moonlight, 3 weeks into the trial, the jury members were taken to the same parking lot where Everett had supposedly seen David. They stood in the same spot under similar conditions as Everett. They could hardly see anything. In reality, they couldn't even notice a nearby garbage can, which was said to be near where the car was parked. Several neighbors of the Dovalibys also contradicted the witness's account regarding the car. The defense lawyers built their case around the fact that a remarkably similar crime occurred in the same neighborhood about a year after Jacqueline's abduction. On September 2, 1989, Perry Hernandez broke into a home in Blue Island and kidnapped a 6-year-old girl while her family slept. He entered by breaking a window and made his way inside without waking anyone. The man took the girl to a railroad bridge near the Calumet River, tormented her, and then allowed her to return home. This happened within a mile and a half of where Jacqueline was found. An interesting detail emerged. The girl Hernandez was living with at the time also owned a Chevy Malibu, and Perry often stayed overnight at her apartment. In fact, even on the night before Jacqueline's disappearance, someone had entered another home in Midlothian. Elizabeth Siki woke up in the middle of the night and thwarted an attempted robbery or abduction of her daughter. She identified the person she saw in her home that night as Perry Hernandez
and expressed confidence that he intended to abduct her 7-year-old daughter, whom she found tightly wrapped in 3 towels, as if someone had intended to take her away. While this may seem like more than a coincidence, Judge Richard Neville stated that he did not consider this evidence and prohibited Cynthia and David's defense from presenting these facts in court. However, the little girl abducted by Perry Hernandez was invited to testify. She recalled that while she was with the kidnapper under the bridge, he held a rope, as if threatening her with it. Besides the striking similarities between the 2 cases, this demonstrated that a small child could indeed be taken from a bedroom without waking anyone. However, in court, the defense made a mistake by failing to establish a connection with the jury members. They wanted David to take the witness stand and firmly declare his innocence, looking them in the eye, but that didn't happen. The most significant obstacle for the defense turned out to be the 17 autopsy photographs and remains presented to the jury. The prosecutors claimed that the photos were meant to help determine the time and cause of death. The defense believed that these photos simply contributed to bias among the jury members. An attorney explains, "You're shown a beautiful girl next to a photograph of her body, and of course the jury members thought someone must pay for this crime. However, the photos didn't convince the judge, who dropped the charges against Cynthia because her only connection to the crime was being in the house. The judge ordered to keep his decision secret because David's fate still lay in the hands of the jury due to the testimony of Everett Mann. After 14 hours, the jury delivered their verdict: guilty. Everyone believed that David would be acquitted, and the media were already waiting for him outside the courthouse for interviews. It was a shock to everyone that he was found guilty. The judge sentenced David to 45 years in prison. Many didn't understand why the jury had no doubts about his guilt, but suddenly everything fell into place. In an interview with a reporter, the jury foreperson confessed why a guilty verdict was reached. It turns out that the jury saw photographs of the Dovalibi home. In one photo, the bedroom door of young Davy showed a dent from a fist, and the jurors believed this indicated David Dovalibi's violent nature. Coming to this conclusion, the jury members decided that there had been a lot of violence in the house. How wrong they were. The fist-sized dent had appeared long before David moved into the house with Cynthia, and perhaps even before Jacqueline's birth. David's younger brother had struck the door with his fist when he was a teenager. The house belonged to David's mother, and the family always had more important things to spend money on, and the door was never replaced. Neither the defense nor the prosecution mentioned this dent, so the jury's decision was based on things that were not even discussed in court. The jury foreperson added that if they had their way, they would have accused Cynthia as well. During this time, Cynthia fought for custody of Davy. Several psychologists and social workers testified, stating that there was no hint that Davy had ever been mistreated, and Cynthia was a kind and loving mother who doted on Davy, and he on her. By mid-July, Davy was allowed to return home to his mother and his recently born sister, Carly Marie. The fact that the jury was biased against David needed to be used to challenge the verdict. Cynthia and the family's friends formed a committee to fight for David's release. One committee member offered a $10,000 reward for any information about the crime. Additionally, the committee allowed them to connect with people who could assist with the case. One of those people turned out to be Robert Byman, an attorney from the Chicago law firm Jenner and Block, who volunteered to work on the case pro bono. Initially, due to police statements, he also believed in David's guilt, but after studying the case materials, he realized there was no evidence against him at all. He understood that David was wrongly accused due to human nature. Byman explained, 12 good and decent members of the jury were entrusted with deciding the fate of this case. Their choice was simple: to stand up and leave, saying, "Sorry, Jacqueline, we can't do anything for you," or to convict the only person sitting before them. They chose the latter. In October, Robert Byman filed a petition for David's release based on new evidence. Gerald Bauman, a prisoner at Cook County Jail, claimed that he had overheard Perry Hernandez confess to the murder. However, after the petition was filed, Gerald refused to sign his previously given sworn statements, fearing for his safety, and claimed that he had received threats after news of this new evidence came to light. The appeal garnered such a significant response that, for the first time, the Illinois Appellate Court allowed video recording of the case proceedings. The Illinois Appellate Court had 3 options: uphold the guilty verdict, order a new trial, or completely exonerate David, which would mean he could never be tried for this case again. 5 months later, the court's decision was announced. Complete exoneration. The court ruled that the chief witness's testimony had been inaccurate and unreliable, and the prosecutors had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that David was the only person with the opportunity to commit the crime. The judges noted that all the basement windows had been left unlocked that night, and any of them could have allowed the perpetrator inside, but unfortunately they were not checked for fingerprints. They also criticized the decision to show the jury 17 gruesome body photographs that were unnecessary. On November 13, 1991, after spending 18 months in prison, David walked free. I've been a lawyer for almost 30 years, and in all that time there have only been 3 times when I was as happy as I was the day I walked David Dovalibi out of prison. Our judicial system is designed to work in 95% of cases. This time the system failed. It convicted an innocent man, said Robert Byman. However, the Dovalibi family was about to experience yet another shocking turn of events in one of the most paradoxical and unusual murder sagas in modern Chicago history. It became known that Rob Warden and David Protess, who were writing a book about the case titled Gone in the Night, had discovered a new potential suspect. Timothy Guess was a 31-year-old brother of Jacqueline's biological father. Timothy had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and lived in a house with his mother not far from Jacqueline's home. Initially, he claimed to have been working at the Park Avenue restaurant in Harvey on the night of the murder, and 3 restaurant employees confirmed his alibi. However, now 2 of them had recanted their statements. At least 5 regulars of the establishment also claimed that Timothy wasn't there that night. Warden and Protess spoke to Timothy, who told them that he often heard voices in his head and suffered from memory lapses. He told them that he was guided by a spirit, and this spirit had allowed him to describe the layout of the Dovalibi house, even though he had never been inside. He could even describe how to get to Jacqueline's bedroom. Timothy described the blanket in which the body was wrapped, and somehow knew that the light in the bedroom was off on the night of her disappearance. However, Timothy was never seriously considered a suspect even after this information came to light. He passed away in 2002. Protest said, "I felt that the case was solved, but I never thought anyone would be held accountable for the crime. The state would be too embarrassed to admit they had wrongly accused Cynthia and David." Since then, the Dovalibi family has moved and changed their last name due to the excessive attention on their lives. They still hope that Jacqueline's murder will be solved. Something terrible happened in that ranch-style home in Midlothian, Illinois, on the night of September 9, 1988. But 3 decades later, there are still no answers as to what exactly transpired. While the local police claim the case is open, there are evidently no leads being pursued. Every U.S. citizen has the right to invoke the Fifth Amendment, but when Cynthia and David exercised that right, they found themselves at the center of a wrongly and negligently conducted investigation.
Robin Hood of the 21st century. Instead of Sherwood Forest, he operated in a gated community in Florida. Instead of a horse, he maneuvered through the city streets in a luxurious Mercedes. But what would remain unchanged is his assistance to those who are far less fortunate in life. And so it continued until one fateful day when the well-established scheme went awry.
This story begins on September 8, 2014, in Florida. The previous evening, spouses Nan Yao and Jill Sue returned from a trip to Malaysia, where Nan Yao had been giving lectures. In the morning, the entomology professor shook off the fatigue from the flight and headed to work at the University of Florida. Jill allowed herself a bit more sleep, but got up around 9:30 when her 20-year-old son, Justin, also left home. He worked a part-time job as a professor's assistant. Shortly after noon, Justin's father called him. He wanted to confirm if the young man was at home. Justin replied that he was at work. His father called him because he noticed something unusual on the surveillance camera in the house. He asked his son to come back and check if everything was all right because the camera suddenly stopped transmitting images. 15 minutes later, Justin had already parked his car at home, entered through the garage, passed the sleeping dog in the corridor, and first checked a camera near the kitchen. However, the camera was missing, leaving only a dangling cable where it used to be connected. Justin knew that only his mother was in the house, and he couldn't fathom why someone would target her and rip the camera out with its wire. The situation was the same with the camera in the living room. As he walked into his room, Justin immediately noticed someone had been rifling through his belongings. Justin, an avid hunter and diver, collected knives, and some were now missing. He heard the sound of running water in the parents' bathroom and headed there. Upon entering the bathroom, he saw it filled with water and blood. His mother's lifeless body floated face down. Justin immediately thought of his father and called him. Nan Yao instructed his son to contact the rescue service, and Justin complied. He informed the dispatcher that his mother had done something to herself, the most rational explanation given what he saw at that moment. However, pulling his mother out of the water, he realized he had misunderstood everything. Her hands and legs were bound, and her body bore multiple wounds. Still on the line with the dispatcher, Justin declared that a murder had occurred. Rushing home, Nan Yao wanted to embrace and comfort his son, who had started having a fit of hysteria, but the officers did not allow him. Nan Yao was not aware of it, but it was the first sign that the police considered his son a suspect. The reason was that a folding knife belonging to Justin was lying near the front door. Another hunting knife, a gift from the mother to the son, became the murder weapon. The police found it at the bottom of the bathtub. There, the criminal also threw an emergency alarm panel. He took with him 2 surveillance cameras. It was also evident that the family's belongings had been rifled through. In the glass back door of the house, there was a hole the size of a doggy door. However, investigators were confident that it was not a burglary gone wrong, but a staged act, and a clumsy one at that, because the hole seemed too small for an adult to squeeze through, and the criminal took nothing besides the cameras. The police believe that the crime occurred in a fit of rage. Usually when a robber breaks into a house, they do not end up delivering more than 20 blows to the victim. Detectives delved into the lives of the victim's family. Nan Yao and Jill first met in Japan when she came as an exchange student, and he was working as a teacher. Afterward, Nan Yao went to the United States to pursue his doctoral degree, while Jill continued her travels in Southeast Asia. Approximately 2 years later, he received a postcard from her, deeply moved to learn that she was in Thailand, volunteering to aid Cambodian refugees. When she returned to America, the two married and adopted a daughter, Amanda. 3 years later, Justin joined the family. Jill not only remained a wonderful mother to her children, but also found the strength and time for volunteer work. She recorded audiobooks for people with visual impairments. There was no doubt that the Sue family members loved each other deeply. However, tension arose in the last few months. Justin dropped out of college, which of course displeased his parents. Yet what intrigued the police even more was Jill Sue's maiden name, Halliburton. Earl Halliburton had once been one of the wealthiest individuals in the country, amassing his fortune in the oil industry. When Earl passed away, his wealth was distributed among all family members, but the magnate had so many relatives that Jill, Amanda, and Justin received almost nothing. The Sue family's bills were paid not by oil, but by termite control, thanks to Nan Yao's invention of an effective termite trap 30 years ago. Even after Jill's death, her share of the inheritance went to her husband, who considered himself quite affluent. All of Jill and Nan Yao's friends attested that the family lived in love and harmony. Just a few hours after Justin found his mother brutally murdered, he sat in the interrogation room at the police station. Several aspects of his story troubled the investigators. Firstly, how could he not immediately recognize it as murder, given the number of stab wounds inflicted on Jill? Moreover, the murder weapon, a knife, belonged to Justin. It seemed odd that the intruder didn't grab a readily available kitchen knife. Justin showed no signs of a struggle, answered all questions calmly, and did not request a lawyer. He explained to detectives that he left for work around 9:30 a.m., returned home at approximately 12:30 p.m. after his father's call, and initially didn't notice anything unusual. Initially, the officers were calm and delicate with Justin, but the tone of the interrogation quickly shifted to accusatory, especially after catching him in lies. He told his father he was at work on the phone but claimed to be at the college library when talking to the police. He later admitted to lying about that, stating he slept in his car in the parking lot. Justin explained he was worried about how his father would react to him sleeping in the car instead of studying or working, so he lied. Then Justin claimed he took another knife with him when he left the car and returned it later.
Clean, this is your only opportunity.
Oh my God.
You understand?
Your dad.
What? What did I say to my dad? I lied to my dad. I told him I was going to work.
Later, Justin claimed that as he was getting out of the car, he took another knife with him. but then he returned it to its place. So, after discovering Anne's mother, did he go and put the knife in the car? This, of course, was nonsense, and under pressure, Justin admitted that he had lied again. He didn't take any knife with him. However, Justin insisted from the beginning that the intruder broke into the house to steal something and didn't expect to encounter the homeowner. During breaks between interrogations, when investigators consulted with forensic experts about evidence in Nan Yao, Justin ran around the room shouting, crying, and begging to be released.
Please let me out.
He was obviously in shock and couldn't calm down. In the adjacent room, Nan Yao heard his son's agony, but couldn't do anything because it was his turn to answer questions. After all, he was the one who raised the alarm that day. Nan Yao explained that around 12:15, he decided to check the surveillance cameras in the house. Unexpectedly, he saw an unfamiliar person, a fleeting figure in a mask that appeared for just a moment, heading towards the kitchen corner. As soon as the figure disappeared from view, the camera feed was lost. Nan Yao thought it could be his son. Justin sometimes deliberately blocked the cameras so his father couldn't see anything when friends visited, as he did 2 days ago when his parents were in Malaysia. But Justin told his father he was at work. Worried because Jill didn't answer calls, Nan Yao became anxious and asked his son to go home. Essentially, Nan Yao only saw the eyes of the intruder and described him as a tall and slender young man. Detectives couldn't help but notice that Justin fit this description. They seemed to be setting father and son against each other. They pointed out to Nan Yao that Justin matched his description. They told Justin that his father suspected him of murder. However, even when Justin was on edge and unsure of what to believe, Nan Yao never bought into it. Regardless of the tactics the investigators chose, they consistently pressured Justin for 11 grueling hours. But Justin maintained his innocence, requested a polygraph test, and insisted that they would come to apologize when the case was solved.
When you guys find out you're wrong, I hope you come and say sorry to me, man, or something.
If there was anything that could help the young man, it was the image of the intruder seen by his father. However, the hitch was that the Su family had agreed to a 2-week trial period during which recordings from their cameras would be saved, and this period ended exactly 2 days before the crime. As the couple was in Malaysia and likely forgot to renew this service, there were simply no recordings. In other words, Nan Yao saw the real-time image, and when the image disappeared, it was gone forever. However, other detectives reviewed the surveillance camera footage near the entrance of the gated community where the family lived. They confirmed that Justin left at 9:15 and didn't reappear until 3 hours later when he returned home at his father's request. In other words, the murder occurred while Justin was not at home. After hours of accusations and pressure at the police station, they simply opened the door and allowed him to go home. Waiting for him behind the door was his father, who did his best to comfort his son. Unlike the police, he never believed in his son's guilt for a moment. In any case, Justin provided the police with a new lead that opened up an entirely new direction for the investigation. 2 days before the parents returned from Malaysia, Justin organized a party. The company was not very large, about 25 people around the age of 20, but now the list of people to be interrogated significantly increased. They were all invited to the station, and DNA and fingerprints were taken. No one objected. By that time, everyone already knew what had happened to Justin's mother and were willing to help. They mentioned that they were aware of the cameras because Justin had warned them and asked them to behave properly. Almost all the guests were his old friends, but not everyone. Some suggested that the police should pay attention to a guy with a bad reputation who had previously been arrested by the police. When officers arrived at his place, he admitted that he was expecting them. He confirmed that he had been arrested before, but for controlled substances, not robbery. His DNA was already in the database, so he had no problem providing it again. The young man had an alibi, and there were no scratches or signs of struggle on his body. In general, the police spoke with 30 people, and besides this guy, no one had legal issues. It seemed like the investigation was at a standstill, but that was not the case. Throughout this time, forensic experts were comparing DNA found at the crime scene, and after 9 days of investigation, news came from the laboratory. They had a match, and incredibly, the suspect's name was in the database. The DNA belonged to 20-year-old Diante Rezeles. Detectives pondered whether there might be an innocent reason for Diante being in the house. Perhaps he knew Justin, who was a year younger. The detective called Justin and listed 3 names, 2 of which were made up to test him. He didn't recognize any of them, including Diante. Diante grew up and lived near the Sioux family home. However, unlike Justin, he was raised by a single mother earning a minimum wage. Diante was not a typical child. He excelled in school, surprisingly well-read, and teachers loved him. However, by adolescence, he became bored with mundane lessons and got involved with a bad crowd. By the age of 18, he had been arrested 8 times, mostly for robberies. His modus operandi sounded familiar to the detectives. He would rent expensive cars and disguise himself to explain his presence in affluent neighborhoods. Diante targeted luxurious mansions in gated communities near the water, infiltrating homes through openings in rear glass doors and disabling surveillance cameras when possible. However, he never attacked the homeowners. If he thought someone was at home, he would flee. In his neighborhood, Diante was liked and considered a Robin Hood figure. He generously shared his loot, paying for others' electricity bills and rent. He could spend $1,000 on diapers and food for single mothers. Perhaps this is why no one believed or wanted to believe he was capable of the accusations against him. On July 15, 2016, almost 2 years after Jill's murder, an unexpected turn of events occurred during what started as a routine court hearing. The prisoner accused of first-degree murder, restrained in handcuffs and shackles, managed to escape from the crowded courtroom. This prisoner was none other than Diante Laskovski. How did he pull off such an escape? When investigators listened to the recordings of the prisoner's phone calls, they realized the plan was orchestrated by teenagers. Everything was set up that morning. The key was to obtain the handcuff key. Diante had weakened the prison jumpsuit to make it easier to run, and he wore regular clothes underneath. When he was led into the courtroom in handcuffs and shackles, another inmate shielded him while removing the chain from his waist, allowing Diante's hands some movement. He entered the courtroom, surrounded by other prisoners awaiting their hearings. Undoing the handcuffs, he waited for his accomplices to be ready. His twin cousins, acting as Diante's eyes and ears, were also present in the courtroom. As soon as a car approached, one cousin signaled to the other, who then signaled to Diante. When new prisoners were brought into the courtroom, Diante simply stood up and ran. Once outside, he discarded the prison jumpsuit and, knowing the route, which his accomplices had undoubtedly described to him, he sprinted out of the building to a waiting car. Days passed, 2, 3, 4. The fugitive eluded officers, and the reward for his capture grew to $50,000. His family and friends refused to assist the police. On the contrary, they did not believe in his guilt and did what they could to protect him. People couldn't comprehend how a robber, who avoided confrontation with homeowners, had evolved into a killer, assaulting a woman with more than 20 knife wounds. Yet, someone decided to turn in Diante, revealing he was hiding in a motel. 6 days after the escape, Diante Laskovski was captured. He offered no resistance during the arrest. In the subsequent months, all 8 friends who aided Diante's escape were apprehended and charged. This demonstrated Diante's intelligence and extraordinary charisma, convincing these individuals to risk their freedom for him. After his arrest, Diante wrote a letter to the judge from whose trial he escaped, apologizing for the escape. He explained that he had to free himself to find evidence of his innocence. However, when he was apprehended, he was merely sitting in a hotel, interacting with friends, and visiting adult websites. The trial began in 2021, and as with everything in this story, it concluded with an incredible twist. The prosecution was convinced of the case because Diante could not explain the presence of his DNA on the 3 crucial elements of the crime: the belt used to tie the victim, one of Justin's knives, and the back door. The version of events seemed to suggest itself. Diante broke into the house with the intention of robbery. Suddenly, he encountered the homeowner and a struggle ensued. At some point, the woman tried to escape onto the street through the front door, according to a neighbor of the Sioux family. It was noon when she heard a scream from the neighbor's house. She managed to notice an object at the front door that sharply moved inside the house. She thought it was a dog. However, investigators and the prosecutor believed it was Jill screaming when Diante dragged her back into the house. After that, he must have struck her with Justin's knife, as the sharp protrusion on the murder weapon exactly matched the head injury on Jill. When the woman lost consciousness, the perpetrator took her to the bathtub, tied her up, and inflicted knife wounds. Despite detectives initially thinking the criminal wanted to create the appearance of a robbery, the evidence actually matched an interrupted burglary. Additionally, Deonte's escape from the courtroom and his attempts to persuade friends to provide him with an alibi worked against him.
Deonte bribed a prison guard to get a phone, thinking he had succeeded. However, all his calls were, of course, monitored by the police. The defendant asked his friend to lie for him, saying he was in Georgia, not Florida, on the day of the murder. Even though Deonte's phone records proved he was in Florida, he tried to find an explanation for the main prosecution evidence and asked his friend to lie about the DNA. He suggested his friend pretend someone attacked Deonte, cut him, and took his blood to leave at the crime scene. The guy reasoned that accusing a person who was no longer alive would prevent further questioning. However, he didn't know that forensic experts hadn't found his blood at the crime scene and obtained DNA from his other biological materials. It seemed like the evidence was indisputable, but the jury deliberated for 5 days and found Deonte Razilis guilty of involuntary manslaughter, not first-degree murder as he was charged. It was a blow to Jill's family, but that was the jury's decision. Or was it? The judge began asking each member of the jury one by one if they agreed with the verdict. It was a standard procedure in court. Therefore, the unexpected answer from the jury foreperson was surprising. She said no. Later, she explained her decision. When the jury deliberated, they couldn't ignore the evidence against Deonte, but 3 people were against convicting the pleasant young man of first-degree murder. They argued and argued, eventually compromising on involuntary manslaughter. However, when the jury foreperson saw the reaction of the defense attorneys in the courtroom, clapping Deonte on the back, smiling, giggling, and congratulating each other on the victory, she declared that she disagreed with the verdict. In her opinion, Deonte deserved a more severe punishment. The trial ended in nothing. A few months later, there was a retrial with new jurors, and this time, the defendant was found guilty of first-degree murder. Involuntary manslaughter meant that Deonte would spend a maximum of 15 years in prison. For first-degree murder, he faced the death penalty or life imprisonment. The Sue family asked the prosecutors to waive the death penalty because that's what Jill wouldn't have wanted. Deonte was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This case was unusual from the very beginning to the end. The police claim their task is to be the voice of the victim. However, it seems they didn't think through this statement. After all, Justin's mother would hardly want to accuse her son of her murder. The most horrifying part is that the police actions were used by Deonte's lawyers. For them, Justin was the perfect alternative suspect. Allegedly, they had a fight with his mother, and the son killed her with his knife. Detectives pressured and harassed Justin, hoping to record a confession, but all they captured were vehement false accusations against the young man, which became a problem for the prosecution. But the most astonishing aspect of this case was how successfully Deonte manipulated people. Overall, he coerced at least 16 individuals into illegal actions to help him escape and fabricate alibis, including 3 young women, each of whom considered herself his girlfriend. Many still do not believe in his innocence, assuming that the police found a scapegoat, and Deonte would never exhibit such cruelty. Currently, the young man is in prison, hoping that his release will be attributed not to appeals or exemplary behavior, but to Kim Kardashian, who is known for her advocacy for prisoners' rights. This is an excellent indicator that Deonte might never regain his freedom.
On April 18, 2011, Jessica Bullock couldn't sit still all day. It had been a whole day since she had been able to reach her mother, 46-year-old Rebecca or Becky Porter, whereas they usually talked every day. Jessica was particularly concerned because her mother had been complaining of feeling unwell, possibly food poisoning or something similar. Jessica urged her mother to go to the hospital, but Becky, who disliked missing work, kept putting it off. On April 17th, the last time they spoke, Becky promised her daughter she would check on herself in the morning. Yet, evening had come the next day, and there was still no word from her mother. Jessica checked with other family members, but they couldn't reach Becky either. Jessica deserves credit. She could have assumed that with Becky's husband, Russell, or Rusty, as his relatives lived nearby, there was no cause for concern. But no, she decided to check in person. Jessica got into her car and drove 45 minutes to her mother's house. She hadn't been there many times, but she immediately sensed that something was wrong. One of the doors was wide open. Lights were on inside the house, and her mother's car was parked in the driveway. Jessica approached the door and called out for her mother, but all she got in response was chilling silence. It was a scene straight out of a horror movie. The only illuminated house in the middle of a large plot of land, seemingly occupied but unresponsive to calls. Fearing what she might find inside, around midnight, Jessica contacted the Greene County, Missouri Rescue Service. The responding police officers thoroughly searched all the rooms and informed Jessica that there were no intruders inside. However, they couldn't calm her down because there was nobody in the house at all. Instead, they encountered a plethora of details that alarmed even the experienced officers. Disorder reigned in the bedroom. Items were strewn across the floor, including bedding, and the mattress was askew, as if someone had abruptly jumped out of bed. Becky's phone and purse containing credit cards, cash, and documents were left behind. Rusty's medications lay on the bedside table. He took them daily after his cancerous tumor removal, and he would have taken them with him if they had left. However, how could the couple have left the house if their only car, which they shared, was parked at home with the keys in the ignition? In another room, likely a home office, a tangle of cables lay on the floor. But the most alarming discoveries awaited the officers in the kitchen. First and foremost, they were almost overwhelmed by the strong smell of bleach. Puddles of bleach were gleaming on the floor, yet the only bleach bottle under the sink was completely full. The kitchen window was open, and the protective screen on it was torn. Finally, after circling around the house, the officers discovered scattered broken surveillance cameras. It seemed like initially they were positioned to cover maximum area around the house, but someone had walked around the house and destroyed them all. Some cables connected to these cameras ran through the walls of the house, leading to the same home office where the tangle of wires lay. When the officers returned to the room, they realized that the cameras and monitor on the floor were connected to a computer, which was conspicuously absent. This was one of the most telling pieces of evidence, especially considering that Rusty had installed the cameras quite recently. Moreover, it's not common for people to install so many cameras in the middle of a farm. Was Rusty afraid of something? All the findings suggested that the spouses weren't together at the time of their sudden disappearance. The first theory of the detectives was that perhaps Becky and Rusty became victims of a botched nighttime robbery. However, the evidence didn't support this theory. Besides the car and cash, other valuable items like the television remained untouched. Maybe Rusty got into trouble, owed money to someone, and the couple decided to disappear this way. Did one spouse do something to the other, get scared of the crime committed, and flee? Or did someone attack them in the middle of the night? At that moment, investigators were considering numerous scenarios, each worse than the other, and doubted a favorable outcome. The police began questioning friends and relatives of the couple, starting with Rusty's mother, Kay Simmons, who lived in a small house directly behind the family home. She recounted that Rusty and Becky had only been married for about a year. The newlyweds moved into the house on the 49-acre property owned by Kay's parents. Also, less than a kilometer away from the young couple, Kay's brother and Rusty's uncle, Robert Campbell, lived with his wife Carolyn. Rusty and Becky seemed like a very happy couple, but their relationship raised doubts among their close circle. Some were uneasy about the 12-year age gap between the spouses, and Jessica and her brother even skipped their mother's wedding. On the evening of the previous day, the 17th, Rusty's son dropped by to ask his mother for painkillers because Becky wasn't feeling well. According to Kay, Rusty behaved as usual and didn't tell his mother anything that would worry her. She also didn't hear any strange sounds later that night. But when she stepped onto the porch the next morning, she saw Becky's car. Kay was surprised because Becky was a very responsible, hard-working woman who never left for work later than 7:30. Despite her son and daughter-in-law living just a few steps away from her house, she tried not to intrude and didn't go to them, simply assuming that Becky stayed home because she was unwell. But now she was certain that something had happened to her son and daughter-in-law before the morning of the 18th. Meanwhile, detectives questioned her about Rusty and Becky's relationship. Did they have any problems? Could anyone have harbored a grudge against them? And Kay immediately thought of one person. Before marrying Rusty, Becky spent 26 years in a marriage with a church pastor. However, they decided to divorce. And according to their friends, they couldn't part amicably. The former spouses fought for a long time over ownership rights of the restaurant they had previously managed together. They had been divorced for only 4 months when Becky met her future husband online. Naturally, this piqued the interest of investigators, and on the 4th day of the investigation, they questioned the ex-husband. However, it quickly became apparent that he had no connection to Becky and Rusty's disappearance. Although their divorce was accompanied by scandals, the man continued to live his life, and he had a solid alibi for the time of the couple's disappearance. Moreover, he seemed genuinely upset about what could have happened to them. After ruling out Becky's ex-husband, the police continued to delve into the personal lives of the newlyweds. Once again, the investigators quickly uncovered something interesting. Becky had complained that she couldn't stand it anymore and things couldn't continue like this. When the police questioned her daughter Jessica about this, she said that her mother had confided in her that she and her husband had been arguing frequently lately. Of course, various negative scenarios immediately sprang to the detectives' minds, suggesting that Rusty might have done something to Becky and then fled. However, unlike Becky's family, all of Rusty's relatives and friends unanimously insisted that he sincerely loved his wife, and they had never seen him happier. He truly loved her and had changed for the better because of her. So why did the woman complain to her daughter about problems? It turned out that Becky had grievances, not against her husband, but against his family, specifically against one person. Becky's grievances were directed towards Rusty's uncle, Robert Campbell. Robert lived nearby Rusty and Becky on the same 49-acre property. Kay and her brother Robert had always been very close, but he didn't like the fact that his nephew had settled on the property, which he likely considered entirely his own. He was very possessive about anything that belonged to his parents, down to the smallest details. The rift between uncle and nephew had escalated to the point where both had tried to obtain restraining orders against each other multiple times. The last time Rusty filed a complaint against his uncle was 1 or 2 weeks before the disappearance. In his statement, Rusty described how Robert, passing by the couple's house, shouted that Rusty should be careful because he wouldn't stay there for long. When investigators spoke to Robert, he didn't deny the obvious and admitted that his relationship with his nephew was strained, but he claimed that the threats were just words without meaning. Moreover, he had more reason to fear Rusty, as he was just an old man with health problems, and of course, he would never harm his nephew or his wife. Additionally, Robert had a very solid alibi. He worked as a long-haul truck driver, and during the couple's disappearance, he was headed to Texas with his wife. This was confirmed by phone records for both Robert and his wife, Carolyn. With Becky's ex-husband and Rusty's uncle ruled out as suspects, investigators hit a dead end. However, another crime shook them out of it. On April 25th, a week after the couple's disappearance, police were called to the scene of a double homicide of another married couple. The second crime eerily resembled the disappearance of the Porter couple, and it also began with a call to 911. Early in the morning around 5 o'clock, a neighbor of the couple called emergency services and said he had scared off a stranger wearing a black hoodie. The person ran away down the road. When officers arrived, they found Donald and Helen Willingham murdered. They had been attacked with a knife. The similarities were striking. An unknown assailant had broken into both couples' homes. Almost nothing was stolen, and there were no obvious suspects. Furthermore, Donald was a pastor, and Becky had been married to a pastor for over 20 years. Investigators pondered whether the cases were connected, or if it was just an astonishing coincidence. Was there a serial killer roaming the county, targeting married couples? However, a breakthrough occurred in the Donald and Helen Willingham case 3 months later. A young man named Jose Huckleberry was arrested on charges of robbery. After 7 hours of interrogation, he confessed to the murders. When detectives learned his motive and the details of the attacks, they had to admit that these two cases were not linked. The situation for the investigation was not improving. All the evidence collected up to that point suggested that Rusty and Becky's disappearance was linked to some crime. But what? Now the investigators had neither a motive nor any suspects. The couple's relatives and friends did everything possible to keep the public aware of the case. They printed a huge number of flyers and posted them in all frequented places, gave interviews to local media, and of course, continued to cling to the only glimmer of hope in the realm of dark thoughts and forebodings. Hope. Despite the grim circumstances, the community remained supportive, rallying around the missing couple's loved ones and assisting in any way they could. The search for Rusty and Becky continued, fueled by determination and the unwavering belief that answers would eventually surface. And suddenly, completely unexpectedly, a new lead emerged. A prisoner serving time in the local jail came forward with information that would interest investigators. Shortly before his arrest, he was relaxing in a bar where he met a man named Tony Friend. They struck up a conversation during which Tony boasted about several crimes he had committed. Among them was the murder of Rusty and Becky Porter. Detectives were skeptical of the informant, who naturally came forward only in hopes of striking a deal with the prosecutor. However, they were obligated to investigate. At the very least, they needed to find out who this Tony Friend was. The more they delved into the man's past, the fewer doubts remained about the informant's words. Tony Friend, 43, had a history of repeated involvement in violent attacks and armed robberies, rather than minor offenses, indicating a propensity for cruelty. However, it was only after examining his phone data that detectives believed they had a solid lead. On the night of April 17th, he was in close proximity to Rusty and Becky Porter's home, and then he headed towards the Cedar Creek area, known for its vast expanse of dense forest. Although investigators didn't know exactly where, they invited him in for questioning, but it proved to be a futile exercise. Tony denied any connection to the couple, claiming he hadn't committed any crimes and had no knowledge of the matter. He didn't answer most of the questions, and those he did answer were so evasive that essentially the only thing he confirmed was his name and age. Detectives had hoped for a more fruitful outcome, but they were now convinced that they needed to dig deeper in this direction. Knowing that Tony had been near the missing couple's home before heading towards Cedar Creek, investigators decided to speak with his relatives and friends. Since Tony grew up in the area, he likely knew it well, and there could have been a secluded spot known only to his close acquaintances. They were right. Tony's cousin immediately recalled a place where they used to play as children. It was an area with dense vegetation near Cedar Creek, inaccessible by car. The kids called it the bulldozer spot because that's where old, non-functional cars were dumped. There were also dilapidated and abandoned cabins, which had been falling apart since they were children. The woman led the police to this location, and it turned out to be the piece of information they had been missing. On July 21st, the police headed to the specified location in Cedar Creek, specifically to the old cabin where Tony used to play with his friends in his childhood. Immediately, they detected a distinct smell, the unmistakable odor of decomposition. In the center of the dilapidated cabin, amidst piles of debris, they found a hole in the wooden floor. Inside, they discovered the bodies of two individuals, still dressed in their pajamas. Blood at the scene indicated that they were killed right there. The bodies had significantly decomposed, and investigators relied on dental records and DNA to confirm their identities. It was Rusty and Becky. Autopsies revealed that each of them had died from a single gunshot wound to the right temple, fired at close range. The discovery of the bodies dashed the last hopes of Becky and Russell's family to see them alive. It was even more difficult for them because they couldn't comprehend why someone would do such a thing. It was an execution-style murder. However, the investigators' task shifted from searching for bodies to finding the killer, and all circumstantial evidence pointed to one suspect. The police had another ace up their sleeve. Despite Tony's hardened criminal background, modern technology played a crucial role in the investigation. Officers revisited Tony's phone data and discovered that 3 of his close associates, his wife, Wendy Friend, his son, Philip Friend, and his nephew, Dusty Hicks, had followed a similar path to Tony on the night of April 17th, the day the couple went missing. If Tony remained tight-lipped, perhaps they could pressure one of them. Investigators identified 26-year-old Philip, Tony's son, as the weakest link among the accomplices. During the period between the couple's disappearance and the discovery of the bodies, Philip had been implicated in a theft and was serving time in prison. He had already experienced incarceration, so when detectives threatened him with charges of double homicide, he agreed to talk. On December 17th, the young man revealed that his father had offered him a job to ensure that 2 individuals would never celebrate another birthday. It was criminal slang for murder, and Philip understood the gravity of the task and agreed to it. So, on April 17th, according to the boy's account, his father, Wendy, Dusty, and he got into the car and headed to Rusty and Becky's house. Wendy stayed in the car while the others put on gloves, balaclavas, taped the cuffs of their sleeves and pants with tape to not leave a single hair at the crime scene, grabbed a bottle of cleaning solution with bleach, and headed towards the family's home. They destroyed the cameras and searched the entire house for a way inside, but they were unsuccessful. They were about to leave when Dusty noticed a partially open kitchen window. They cut through the protective screen, pushed the window open, and Tony helped Dusty crawl inside. Dusty then opened the back door. The accomplices then entered the couple's bedroom. They startled Rusty and Becky awake, and Dusty and Tony pointed their weapons at them. Naturally, they were terrified, begged for mercy, and didn't understand who had burst into their home and what they wanted. But the criminals had more important matters to attend to than explaining anything to their victims. They generously poured bleach all over the kitchen floor, took the computer where the surveillance camera footage was stored, and, after tying the victims' hands with zip ties, led them to the car. It's remarkable how much effort the accomplices put in to avoid getting caught. In light of this, it's simply astonishing that Tony himself confessed his involvement in this to a stranger in a bar. Be that as it may, they dropped off Wendy at home and went to the location chosen by Tony, now known to the police. The accomplices parked the car in a field right in front of the dense forest, so vast that no one would hear a gunshot or screams. Tony instructed Dusty and Philip to wait while he led the spouses away. In their pajamas, barefoot, at gunpoint, they obediently walked into the woods. It's hard to imagine what they were feeling at that moment. Surely they understood they wouldn't be coming back, but they obediently pressed forward. According to Philip, he and Dusty sat for 10 minutes when they heard a gunshot, and it was only another 10 minutes later that the second shot rang out. The horror those 10 minutes must have been for the second victim. Tony never revealed what happened in that abandoned shack in the middle of the dense forest. There are many self-evident assumptions about this, but due to lack of evidence, they remain just that. And Philip could only talk about what he knew for sure. And according to his admission, it was only when his father emerged from the darkness of the forest alone that he began to understand what they had just done. After Philip's confession, investigators had only one question left that demanded an answer, although they already suspected the answer. Why did his father decide to kill two people he had never even met before? For this job, he was promised $100,000. And for Philip, this was no secret. It was Rusty's uncle, Robert Campbell, and his wife, Carolyn, Tony's sister. It was Robert who was the mastermind behind the murder, planning the attack for a time when he himself was supposed to be away in Texas. In fact, aside from disputes over the 49-hectare plot of land they lived on, he had a second motive. Robert was selling stolen equipment and using his property for these purposes. Rusty and Becky didn't like this, and they weren't going to stay silent about it. They raised a fuss that annoyed Robert. Becky was very afraid that unknown individuals were lurking around their home, so her husband installed cameras facing different directions from the house. Irritated by their behavior, Robert decided to get rid of them, to silence them forever. Naturally, he turned to Tony, a hardened criminal, and conveniently enough, his wife's brother. As the police learned, he approached Tony with a request to kill his nephew. Tony inquired about Becky, to which Robert coldly replied, "If she's there too, then kill her too." Tony agreed. Robert was arrested, but he stubbornly denied everything. He constantly reminded the investigators that he had an alibi. When the charges were brought against him, Tony and Dusty pleaded guilty. Tony and Dusty were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder. Wendy decided to try her luck in court, was found guilty, and received a similar punishment. Robert also opted for trial, which made prosecutors nervous. Except for Philip's testimony, they had nothing solid against him. However, Philip agreed to testify against him and performed well in court. It was thanks to him that Robert was convicted. He was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. He will never see the light of day again. For his cooperation and willingness to plead guilty, Philip was sentenced to 13 years. Robert's wife, Carolyn, took her own life, unable to bear it all. She faced charges only for perjury. Arguments in people's lives are common and inevitable, and nobody really expects that a dispute will result in such consequences as murder. Becky and Rusty didn't like Robert's illegal side job, and they didn't hesitate to speak out about it directly. They knew it was dangerous. Becky openly feared the suspicious individuals who appeared near their home, and Rusty even installed a series of cameras to protect his wife. Unfortunately, it didn't save them. On that fateful night, when the couple walked into the woods in their pajamas and barefoot, did they suspect that Uncle Robert was to blame? Wishing to get rid of the troublesome nephew and free up the house? Did the killer say anything to them before pulling the trigger? Or did the spouses believe to the last that it was some random attack, and the quarrels with Uncle Robert were just silly arguments, and he would never harm his nephew and his wife?